Welcome to Post-Burnout.com interviews. My name is Aaron Kavanagh and I'm the website's founder and editor-in-chief. Post-Burnout.com is a culture website dedicated to venerating burnt-out artists the world over. Our interviews are mainly recorded to be transcribed, but every now and again we release the audio in a series we call Post-Burnout.com interviews. If you enjoy what we do, be sure to subscribe. In this edition of Post-Burnout.com interviews, we talk with Dr. Michael Murray Murphy. Michael is a lecturer in music industry, sociology, management and communications at the Dun Laoghaire Institute of Art Design and Technology, IADT. He has past experience working for major labels such as Virgin Records and Imago Records. He's also the author of various peer-reviewed essays discussing the industry, anthropology, cultural significance and the history of music, and has co-edited several books on music. In this interview we discuss his recently published book, Sounds Irish, Acts Global, explaining the success of Ireland's popular music industry. The book uses case studies to document the history of the growth of the music industry in Ireland. The book is co-written by Jim Rogers, who is a communications lecturer at Dublin City University and has published several books on the music industry. Also, full disclosure, I'm a former student of Michael's, and this interview was actually was recorded in essentially 4 parts. We did one part one day and my internet connection died halfway through it, so we were able to continue afterwards, and then just due to time restraints we had to reschedule a bunch of times. So yeah, I kind of left those segments in the editing of this podcast just so you can hear when one segment ends and the next begins. Yeah, I guess the sort of first thing I wanted to ask you just before we get into the book is just kind of your sort of your own background when it came to music. I mean, how did you get into music yourself?
Well, I'm from Limerick, so I grew up, in a city that was my home, that I loved living in. But it didn't feel, Aaron, like I was close to anything in
Mm.
terms of music. My mother once, she went to the local shop, a little shop in suburban Limerick, and a DJ from RTE, Larry Gogan, was there, and he must have been doing a thing where he went around to Ireland and he talked to people in shops and asked them what music they'd like, and do you have any requests for people back home? And we were at home, we were little kids, and to hear this guy from RTE, which see, he was monolithic in our
Yeah.
lives in terms of pop music, and said, and this is here's Obla D, Obla Da, and it's going out to the Murphys, and he named our names,
Yeah.
from their mammy who's in the Fitzgerald's shop doing her shopping. And, I was under 7. So I might have been even 5, might have been 4 or 5. But it was just that moment, Aaron, where I thought, oh, popular music can be in your house. And you think it comes from somewhere that's elsewhere. But you actually can sometimes intersect with it
Yeah.
in strange ways. So I think I was always really, really open to pop music and how it could make me feel. I was very introverted kid, probably an anxious young person. Like wasn't super confident. Hey,
Mhm.
let's do lunch sometime. And music, I think, for introverts, I can only speak from experience, can hit you really, really hard. And then the next huge leap was we were on holidays in Tremor, and my older brother, who's not much older than me, a year and a half, he bought Life on Mars by Bowie. And that suddenly took us into another place in terms of pop music and how pop music can make you feel and what it can make you think about. And, we were 7 or 8 or 9 at that stage then, and listening to rock and roll suicide
Yeah.
on the B side just as much, walking up in our short pants up to national school. Yeah, rock and roll suicide. So, that's something we should be contemplating. But
Yeah.
it really, really seeped very deeply. And then I was completely ready when punk came along. I was just of that era. I was too young to participate, but I was of an age where, no, it took me a couple of goes because initially it was like this doesn't sound like ELO.
Yeah.
These people clearly are not classically trained. They don't sound like Olivia Newton-John. I think I had an ELO record and an Olivia Newton-John.
Yeah.
So I'm not one of these people who can say, oh yeah, my first record was, the Sex Pistols. It wasn't.
Yeah.
I was consuming before that, but absolutely the pivotal records. And I could, if you had a 20-hour show, I could name in sequence the punk records that I bought, where I bought them from, how they made me feel. So I was primed thanks to Obladi, Oblada, RTE, and Bowie for punk. And I know I'm talking too much.
No.
But the next amazing moment was it could have been Larry Gogan again. I believe it was. And he had a competition where he said, if you phone in, like any lucky listener who phones in and can tell us what musician was born as Harry Webb. If you phone in, like you could win a prize. And we thought, like, we've got a phone.
Yeah.
We're going to use it. And we phoned in and said, my older brother, it's Cliff Richard. I said, oh, you're correct. Well done. And, then afterwards they said, you've won a free album. And I don't know if there was any negotiation of what type of album or what type of music would you like. But the prize for correctly identifying Cliff Richard's real name was Love Bites by the Buzzcocks.
Okay.
So Cliff Richard was a big part of my lifelong love because, imagine if you didn't have much money, because we were school children, our parents weren't giving us a load of money saying, hey, here, go, buy a car.
Yeah.
We couldn't have bought a Matchbox car on our income. Yeah. And having a Buzzcocks record that was given to us for knowing something about Cliff Richard, it just felt, wow, we've got to go deeply into this. And, God, that album, like I can still remember not just how it felt, what it sounded like the first time I heard it, but I can remember how it felt in my hands. I can actually remember, Aaron, the texture of the record, the paper.
Yeah. And so then when it kind of came to, I guess, the music scene in Limerick, so would there been any kind of like live scene there? I think the only venue I'd be aware of that be operating at the time was the Savoy, I guess. Was there any other places to see live music? Was there much of a local scene then, or was it all just kind of import?
I was 7.
Yeah.
So I really wasn't, I didn't have my finger on the pulse of Limerick's live music scene. But it's a great question, Aaron, because if you ask people what music venues do they remember, not even ones that they went to, because we left Limerick when I was 7 and moved to Dublin.
Okay.
But we lived very, very close to one of the most celebrated show band ballrooms in Ireland, which was called Jetland.
Okay.
Near Shannon Airport, Limerick, Jetland. And it was from a string of ballrooms around the country whose name all ended in the word land. So it's a great piece of branding. It was Dreamland in the Thai. Fairyland. I don't know where that was. But we moved from Limerick when I was age 7. So then most of my music consumption was living in suburban Dean's Grange in South County Dublin. But no, I was a schoolboy. My parents were very strict. So the idea of going to a gig, I don't remember even going to a disco. In fact, the reason I don't remember is I didn't go to a disco until I did the Leave Cert. So my music experience as a consumer was really, really different to probably some of my contemporaries who had more liberal or relaxed parents who maybe they were going to gigs when they were in 6th year or 5th year in school. But I absolutely know the line that I crossed, in terms of consuming music. And that was do the leave insert, and then you can go to gigs. So my first gig was 1980, just after I'd done the leave insert.
Who was it?
It was the first band that I ever saw on stage were the Tearjerkers from Northern Ireland on Good Vibes, who were kind of a power pop, almost mod band, and they were opening for Dexys Midnight Runners, who
Okay.
were doing their first album. And it was one of the greatest, not just one of the greatest gigs of my life, it was, Aaron, one of the greatest experiences of my life. It changed me. I can say that. It absolutely changed me.
And actually, I saw on LinkedIn a while ago that you actually attended your 5,000 gig with Kraftwerk,
Yeah.
Trinity, which actually I was at too. I didn't see you there. I was at high, but it was a great show. Yeah, I was wondering, like, from all those kind of like years of like seeing live music, did that kind of give you an influence? Because obviously, I mean, your background sort of in music industry in particular. Do you find like, do you think you have the confidence to say what kind of like makes it good live performances, or just a certain kind of magic to things that are just kind of like unquantifiable?
Oh no, no, that's a brilliant question. Here's the great way to know if a gig is good or bad, if it's all right or if it's transcendental. Go to 5,000 of them. To be honest, like
Yeah.
that's where my perspective has been developed. So the Kraftwerk gig, I didn't know how to say that. That it's my 5,000. You're
Yeah,
completely right. I
5,000.
thought, is it my 5,000? But it's actually my 5,000. Um, I went. I wouldn't be the biggest Kraftwerk head. Like I'm aware of them. I know their importance, but I was almost going as a historian and someone who likes a little bit of electronic music very, very passionately. But I wouldn't be a scholar of electronic music. And I it sounds strange, but I almost had a spiritual experience at that Kraftwerk gig in terms of like how it felt. I had no, I was absolutely swept away by how meaningful, how profound, how almost beyond words. I don't have words for describing how I felt at that gig because it really, really was. I thought it was extraordinary. But
Yeah.
I, I was a little, I was actually emotional by thinking, I'm alive to see this band, in this current incarnation. And I'm getting so much joy out of being here on on a cricket pitch
Yeah.
in an inner city
Yeah.
university on this huge footprint of land. And I've seen loads of bands on that particular piece of grass, but I never saw, a gig like that. And I thought, anyone who thinks that electronic music doesn't have spirit or soul missed that gig and the meaning of that gig. So, in terms of do I know what's a good gig or a bad gig? I mean, I did make a living for a large number of years out of working in the music industry. For some of it, I was paid. So I could have been crap at my job and I still would have got paid,
Mhm.
probably for a while, but I must have been okay at my job to have stayed my job. But then when I set my own music company, a music management company, and I managed bands, I lived or died. I paid my rent. I was able to eat. I was able to buy a computer. I was able to have a good lifestyle eventually because of my knowledge, my instinct, my love, my passion for music, and a way of communicating that. So, what's a good gig, Aaron? What's a bad gig? It's purely subjective for me. It's do I think it's great?
Yeah.
But I could also put on the music industry hat and I could reveal to you how the music industry works. I did A&R, like talent scout, call it for what you want, but the people who are finding bands that are going to get record deals, and I was that person for a while, they're no longer looking for things that they like. So that's a strange thing already. So you're out there trying to find bands for other people to enjoy, but you're not those other people. So at best, you're guessing
Yeah.
what they like. And the other absolute truth that people don't realize is that they're looking for the type of band that they think their boss will like. And
Right.
again, like, what does that say
Yeah.
about civilization and culture? That you've got a bunch of people going to gigs trying to find something that their boss would say, oh, well done. Because no one knows what a band is going to sell until you actually offer a product for sale. So I think people haven't realized actually how skewered the music industry is in terms of what we get to hear as music lovers, because it's someone looking for something to make their boss impressed.
Yeah.
That's as lame as you can get. That's as sad as you can get.
Well, obviously you're a lecturer in music industry
Yeah.
at IDT. Full disclosure, I was a former student of yours. I don't know if that's something I need to disclose, but and what's interesting is like obviously, I mean, like this is something that you're lecturing in now, but as for someone yourself, I mean, there's kind of a gap between going to your first gig and I think by the end of that decade already working for Virgin Records, I believe. So I was wondering, in between that kind of time, how did you kind of get involved with the music industry? Where was it sort of obviously now it's something you teach, but was it autodidactic back then? Was it something you had to be self-taught in, or was it something they actually had resources in?
Full disclosure, you're a former student,
Yeah.
and the cup that I'm using for my green tea at the moment, I absolutely picked it thinking, Aaron will think this is a cool cup. So I'm going to hold it up there.
Oh, cool. It's tapes of various Black Flag descendants
Yeah,
and minor threat. That's so cool. Circle
couldn't believe
jerks.
it. Couldn't believe it. So I think that's a really important question, Aaron, and I wish more people were asked it, because my my gathering of experience, of skills, if you want to call them that, really shows how someone with zero connections, with zero confidence, with zero ambition, can end up in an extraordinary place. And I'm one of those people who ended up having my dream job. There is no job that I would have liked to have done more in the entire world than the job that I ended up getting paid to do. So it wasn't born out of family relationships. It was born out of the type of opportunities that life will give you, but only if you're open to them and only if you're in a particular place at a particular time. So I'm a guy who loves music. I buy The Raven by the Stranglers secondhand from a guy in school who I haven't seen ever since. But buying that secondhand was an incredible moment, and having the Stranglers. Like, my brother bought loads of records. Uh, he didn't go to college. I did. He got a job, so he had an income. And records were incredibly expensive in Ireland in 1977 and beyond. So you shouldn't ever expect anyone who's Irish to have the type of record collection that someone who grew up in England or Scotland or Wales has, or even in the States. Like, we were incredibly poor relative to other countries, and records were incredibly expensive relative to other countries. So I buy records when I can, and that's not often. But Mum used to go shopping in Dunnes Stores and Cornelscourt, which was, you know, it was like going to Disneyland for us. It was this huge, huge shopping. And there was a record shop there. So Mum would go shopping and say, do you want to come with me? And we're like, no. And we go to the record shop. And
Yeah.
we'd no money. So we're just taking up space in the record shop, but it's absolutely fueling our passion. So, we're not going to buy anything, but we're just going through the records, looking at everything. And you kind of feel part of the world. I certainly felt part of the world of these creative people just by kind of looking at the records and you study the sleeves. Oh, there's a cartoon of a cat. I wonder what that is. The Year of the Cat. What's that all about? But, and Big Brother and the Holding Company, because, again, it was a cartoon. So, you're young. It's a cartoon. It's like Bugs Bunny. It's like Bugs Bunny doesn't dress like that. So going to record shops was really, really important for someone of my age,
Yeah.
and living in South County Dublin. And luckily, a record shop opened in Dún Laoghaire called Exiles. Two hippies opened it. And Don and Dave. One was really tall, one was really short. And they opened this shop. This was late 70s. There were already two record shops in Dún Laoghaire. And that seems hard to imagine. Plus, they sold records occasionally in Woolworths on the main street in Dún Laoghaire. So vinyl was absolutely part of our consumer culture in a way that no one else has experienced since my generation. Like, vinyl was often a door to consumption. And even if it wasn't, you're studying industrial art. Because you're not just looking at the sleeve, they go, oh, there's a jam thing. I'm like, that looks cool. It's like, what's that saying? What's that meaning? Why is that photograph in brown and white, not black and white? Like, who are those people? Why were they picked to be on that cover? You're really, really going deeply. You're discovering something that's internal that connects with something that's very, very external. And I think you understand this, just from knowing the little bit that I know about you and the way music has affected you. So the record shop in Dún Laoghaire, it's called Exile or Exiles. And decades later, I realized, oh, those hippies. Because I realized, okay, it's on the main street in Dún Laoghaire. It's called Exiles. It's Exiles on Main Street. So it's named after Rollins. But now it takes me at least 20 years to realize that.
That's very clever.
Yeah. But beyond me at the time. So I was in the shop often enough, and I was a punk rocker at heart. And one of the things about my generation of punks, and maybe it was just the suburban punks, maybe just certain suburban clubs, but we felt that the only thing that you really had to do to be a punk was to be more polite than the average citizen.
Okay.
Genuinely. I thought, okay, people are going to think we look a bit scary, older ladies walking in, think, oh, that guy's got people. So we really felt that part of the punk project was to express yourself through your clothes and your hair and your appearance, but that the counterbalance had to be that you had to let them know people that you were not a threat, that you were not anything they should be scared of. So I was an extremely polite young man. And I was in the shop, but not buying that much. And eventually the two hippies said, oh, Michael, they knew my name at that stage. We have to go to the warehouse to pick up some records. Would you, so we could lock up the shop, or like, would you mind minding the shop? Dream job. What does minding the shop in Dún Laoghaire mean? It means, they show you how to use the cash register. So there's an element of trust, which is lovely, for a young person. And you pick the music. So anyone who comes into the shop, I mightn't even talk to them. I hope I wasn't a dickhead to people. I wasn't the kind of the films and the books that you read about record shop personnel being less than helpful. But I was aware, and the first album that I put on when I was in charge of the shop, my first time in charge of anything. So I put on Machine Gun Etiquette by The Damned, and everyone who came into the shop had to listen to that. And then I put on Brian Eno and David Byrne, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. And like, I'm not the most intelligent guy, I'm not the most strategic guy, but I was the guy in charge of the turntable. And it was such a thrill. Like, I don't know how to drive, but imagine that the people who know how to drive must get that same kind of thrill that I got from taking the records out of the bag and playing them in Dunleary.
Yeah.
So I'm I'm in the music industry, Aaron. But it's really just because I'm a polite customer. I'm a polite um, customer who takes up a lot of space.
Yeah.
And then because it's that era, there are fanzines around. You know a good bit about the story of Niall McGurk and the Hope Collective. Paranoid Visions were kind of the local punk band. Things are beginning to come together. And I go to university uh, to buy myself a bit of time. I don't know what I want to do in life, but I know I don't want to get a job, and I want to go to see bands, and I want to be living the type of life other people have better aspirations than me. But my life's ambition in 1980 was to be able to go into record shops as frequently, more frequently than people who had a job.
Yeah.
That was kind of my comparator. Am I going, if someone's got a job and they get paid for it so they can buy records, but I'll spend more time in the record shops than they can because they have to be there. So I went to Trinity in the city centre and went to any gigs that I could. There was a load of free gigs, which was lovely lunchtime gigs. So I was absolutely immersed in music. I had one friend at the time, and we'd gone to see Dexy's Midnight Runners together. So I kind of hung around with him. He went to the art school, the NCAD. So I'd go if there were free gigs there. I had a bit of money. Bizarrely, that summer before I got to university, I won a load of money on a quiz show on
Okay.
RT, a show called Quicksilver. And that was kind of my money for, shameful to say it now, but it was kind of for cans of Coke and Mars bars and records
Yeah.
and going to gigs. That was my money. And then I got the job in the record shop, and I was in Trinity, and very, very luckily, there were lads who lived up my road in Dean's Grange who were such great people. So lucky. And they were just as passionate about music. So I'd hang out with them. We'd go up, listen to The Fall, listen to the Virgin Prunes. They would listen. They were more open-minded to me. So they might have been listening to Darkness on the Edge of Town, bit of Springsteen, bit of Clonage, bit of the Banksy. But I would always leave. Like this is how antisocial I am. I would leave if they were playing a record that I didn't like, and I'd go home and listen to what I wanted. And then I might come back up, maybe they're playing The Fall again, so I can go back up. But I was absolutely focused on spending as much time listening to the music that I loved. John Peel was really, really important to us. But so were RT, the pirate radios were phenomenally important. And then this is a long answer to your question about how do you get into the music industry? And it's just my personal story. So I'm a retailer. Like I'm in a record shop part-time. And then one of the customers from Exiles, now we used to make up nicknames for people. And his nickname was Dexys because he had a wool hat.
Yeah.
Like the first Dexys incarnation. So I was like, oh, Dexys was in that. He was a lovely, polite guy as well, but didn't talk to him more than, oh, that's a great single. But he might have bought a Psychedelic Furs single from me. I said, okay, he's, watch out for him because he likes the furs. And and then I used to see him in town a little bit, Aaron, and I remember seeing him at a Virgin Prunes gig in McGonagall's because he was wearing a long brown coat that shopkeepers, you'll only see this now in period films.
Yeah.
But it was a feature in my life where that there were bicycle messengers for shops. And some of them wore long brown coats, like a lab coat, with this dirty brown paper bag. coloured coats.
Yeah.
And he was at a Virgin Prunes gig. But this coat that you would associate with retail and respectability and someone getting on in life, he had written Dead Kennedys on the back of it. And I thought, that's so transgressive, because it's not some guy in a leather jacket, with the Clash or the Kennedys or something else. It's a brown workman's coat.
Yeah.
And the dead cat, I thought, that's the coolest. But now I might have nodded at him, but I wouldn't have spoken for him. You didn't go up. People like me didn't go up to people and say that's a great coat, or wow, you like that. But he arrived in Trinity. I thought, there's Dexys. He's in Trinity.
Yeah.
So he must have been a year or two after me. But we got talking, because now you're in a big university and there's people who you see who like music. So got chatting to him, because I saw him at the Prunes, and then I saw him, the Teardrop Explodes played in Trinity. Altered Images were meant to play the Christmas Ball. They didn't come. Teardrop Explodes were drummed in to play. And everyone wants an encore, and they don't appear for an encore. And I saw this guy, Dexys, and he got up on stage and he just started going, kind of, let's have a riot to try and persuade the visiting band from Liverpool to play an encore. And I thought, that's an asymmetric response to, can we not just clap? And he was wearing a Dead Kennedys, and I thought, he likes Teardrop Explodes and the Prunes and Dead Kennedys. And, you're thinking, I wonder where life is going to take this young man. But we got chatting in Trinity. He then became the entertainment officer. If you're the entertainment officer in Trinity at that stage, you select the bands. You reach out to the bands. And he had phenomenal taste. And he put on the Prunes, he put on Paranoid Visions, he put on a band, really, really important band that are completely forgotten by history, but that were really essential now to the origins of the Hope Collective, a band called the Pleasure Cell, and Dexys. Now, we knew his real name at that stage, and it was Michael McCahan. He put on the first Pogues tour of Ireland. He organised the Dublin date, that tour, put on the Golden Horde. He booked the Meteors for the Trinity Ball. I think the singer stabbed someone the week before, so he couldn't make it. He was talking to the police. But he also loved traditional Irish music. And we used to organise traditional Irish music concerts with two of the members of Hot House Flowers before they were a band for tourists. So suddenly I'm in a record shop. I'm a record shop guy. So I'm in the industry. And now I'm also helping bands carry their equipment. I'm going to gigs. I'm kind of helping to organize them at some low level, but because he was phenomenally successful manager of student entertainment. And then I also did a bit of writing. There were student magazines, and I would read them and think, okay, they've written about albums I don't like. I wonder if I could write about the Smiths for them. And it did. So writing, working in a record shop, and then helping to organize gigs, or being somewhere, standing beside someone who's organizing gigs. So those were my three ways of getting music industry skills, but they were all accidental. They were all blunders, things I blundered into.
Hi, Michael. Sorry about that. I just had an internet connection issue.
No problem. Delighted to. And I noticed that Love Bites is on my mug, my new punk mug.
Lovely. It all comes back
as
to
we were discussing. So it's great.
So
So,
just going back to how you got into the music industry, you were just about to say you were at a gig at Trinity with the Teardrop Explodes, and Dexys was about to take the stage.
okay, so it cut off there.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Teardrop Explodes come to Trinity. They played in McGonagall's earlier in the week, and they must have been persuaded to stay on because Altered Images couldn't play the Christmas ball in Trinity. And they didn't come out for an encore. People were chanting, and Dexys, see, Dexys is there, and he's wearing a Dead Kennedy's t-shirt. I don't even know if he might have had the sleeves torn off it. I don't know if you remember, that was a look.
Yeah, yeah.
To buy t-shirts, and then we take the sleeves off them. We call them sawn off t-shirts. Um, and Dexy's like was up there on stage. He jumped up on stage, and he'd go, come on, like trying to incite a riot or a frenzy of, make more noise. And I'm thinking, well, surely if we all just clap, they're going to come back if they want. Like, how much louder could we cheer? Or it seemed like an asymmetrical desire
Yeah.
for us to riot to try and get them back on. And they didn't come back on. I think David Balfe, the keyboard player, came back and said, "Oh, sorry, we can't play anymore because Julie's freaking out." Julie been Julian Cope, the lead singer. But so I clocked Dexy's in the shop, then in the Dead Kennedys like jacket, and then there. So okay, I wonder. I was curious as to where life might take that young man. And I was in Trinity, maybe I was in second year, possibly third year. And there's Dexys, like strolling through. And we got chatting. Hey, I recognize you from gigs and from Exiles, which had shut down by that stage. Anyway, Dexys became the Ents officer in Trinity. And this was back where Ents officers, I think, really we haven't acknowledged culturally that the Ents officers of the 1970s and 1980s were architects of the globalized Irish music industry. And, before MCD were so influential and who are now Live Nation in university entertainment. So Dexys, and I had discovered his name, that he had a name by then. His name was Michael McCaughan. And he didn't have any budget. When he got elected by the Students' Union, they said, look, there's something we didn't tell you. There's no money.
Yeah.
I said, well, how can I put on gigs? So now this forced him and anyone who was helping him back into that DIY punk rock thing. Okay, we've no resources, but we love music. We want people to enjoy music, to be exposed to it. And now I was very blinkered. When punk came along, I really, really thought anything recorded before punk didn't matter. Like I just wanted to hear new music. Like what's happening? Who's released a demo tape? I really was obsessively driven to discover and spend as much time immersed in brand new sounds. For some reason, I didn't have the intelligence or the perspective to think, well, you should be listening to stuff from the 1920s, 30s as well. It was like, no. I'm in a race against time. Time is running out, and I have to just listen to the new stuff. So Michael McCaughan, aka Dexys, had a huge, huge love of lots of genres. So he was putting on Irish traditional music. He was putting on classical music. He wanted everyone in Trinity to have the type of music that they personally liked, not just him. He organised the gig that was the pivot for the first Pogues headlining tour of Ireland. He put on, I actually helped him with this before term started. We organised traditional Irish music concerts, for tours. But the people who played them were Fiachna and Liam, who then went on to be in Hothouse Flowers. He was putting on all types of music, including a band that have been forgotten, I think, from Irish cultural history, a band called the Pleasure Cell, who put out one single. He was an early champion for them, possibly their biggest champion in what I would call the music scene, because it's really DIY if you're an entertainment officer. It's a 1 year position. And they were extremely, extremely influential in the eventual foundation of the Hope Collective. They were a band that Niall McGurk found particular, I guess, comradeship in, or he admired their ethics, and he was happy to see someone in Ireland doing what he thought was more associated with Black Flag in the States, or Crass, or Flux, or the anarcho bands in Britain, without the Pleasure Cell sounded particularly like those bands.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm in the music industry in three ways, because I'm also writing a little music column for a Students' Union magazine in Trinity. They reviewed stuff, and I thought, okay, there's a review of a Genesis album. I could write about the Smiths.
Yeah.
Or whatever stuff I was listening to back then. Probably the Stranglers still. And a bit of the American hardcore. So I started doing that, and suddenly I'm in the music industry in three different ways. One, record shop. Two, helping put on gigs. Now, helping in the sense that I'm standing beside my mate Michael McCahan, who's actually organizing it. He was this fantastic manager. He showed what you can do with low resources, including then organizing the Trinity Ball of that year, which at the time was one of the biggest social events of its kind in Europe. And it was run by students, which is remarkable. And I'm in the music industry three different ways, but purely by blunders, by circumstances, by accidents, rather than me applying for any particular job. So the DIY, my interest in music, really opened up doors for me there.
Yeah. And then when it actually kind of came to going to London then to actually kind of work for a label, how'd that go about? And actually, I'm just wondering, had you been familiar with London prior to moving there? Because it's such an enormous place that it's even now with Google Maps and stuff, it's still it can be a difficult place to kind of get from A to B. I was wondering, even though they have perfect public transport there, but I was wondering, how did you find that transition then from going to a place like Ireland to the UK?
Well, I knew a lot about London from punk records.
Yeah.
And then British television and a bit of history and stuff, a bit of British culture. But really, if you think about the hours that I've spent into absorbing information or knowledge or culture from London or about London, again, punk really was my educator.
Yeah.
And I believe my first trip outside of Ireland was on the boat. After my first year in college, I went on the boat to a festival in the middle of nowhere in England, in Staffordshire. But it was, again, talk about a life-changing moment. It was Bauhaus, Gang of Four. It was Simple Minds the week before Sons and Fascination came out. So this incredible, powerful, interesting, dynamic band. Theatre of Hate.
Oh, wow.
The Sisters of Mercy, I think, was their first gig outside of Leeds.
Yeah.
And then from Dublin, you had the Virgin Prunes.
Okay.
And it UK Decay played. So it was 2 days in this stinking, smelly, it smelled of cow poo and straw. But it was bands who I really felt would never come to Ireland.
Yeah.
And 95% of the bands on that bill over the 2 days never did come to Ireland. So if you were passionate about post-punk in 1979, 1980, 1981, even 82 in Dublin, you were listening to music that you felt you'd never get to see unless you left your home country. Now, that gives you a very strange relationship to music because it does seem far away. But the Prunes are there representing Ireland, and it's the Prunes at their normal, which for anyone who hasn't seen them before is, what on earth am I witnessing? So it's great. Like, it was the subliminal message to someone like me was, you kind of can be from Ireland and Dublin, which seemed very, very conformist at that time.
Yeah.
It feels like a very orthodox culture, a very powerfully monolithic culture. And, I was getting little signals from elsewhere of culture that spoke directly to someone of my age. And then the prunes in Dublin were absolutely mind-blowing. What they did, every show was different and you didn't know what was going to happen. So there, I know a little bit about England because I've got on the train, but it's alien. And then Dexies, aka Michael McCahan and myself, we went to London. It must have been my first time in London. Could have been my second, but as I remember, it was my first time in London. And we went over because it was before he became ENTS officer. It was during the summer before students were back. And we thought, let's go and visit record labels and see if they've any music that they'd like me to play in Trinity.
Yeah.
So we got the Virgin Records. And the people couldn't be nicer. So, oh, you're from Dublin. Oh, you're going to be putting on gigs in Dublin. Here's some new music. Like, here's free records. Like, I'm thinking, oh, this is the greatest industry in the world. So we did the tour. We went to, I think we might have gone to Stiff Records, but I don't remember. Certainly went to Chiswick Records. And we went to Beggar's Banquet, and there was a woman there who then came out and said, oh, like, I went to school. I think she went to school in Killiney or Dalkey, like this English woman.
Yeah.
And she, these were the kind of people that you might see a photograph in the NME.
Yeah.
But they didn't feel like people who'd say, oh, like, let me take a lunch break. And we sat on the wall outside this record label talking to this interesting, lovely, glamorous music industry woman who seemed to she gave us the time of day, and then she gave us a load of free records. So again, that was a big, big moment for me, Aaron, because you feel the record labels, they're kind of accessible. It's not a big block of people telling people what to consume. It's people who love music sometimes, or people who are interested in meeting people who love music. And then the tour, like our trip to London, was booked to coincide with getting to see the Psychedelic Furs and the Cramps and the Meteors on for Cramps. And I never thought I'd see those bands. Now, the Furs had come to Trinity. They played before my time there. But that again made me feel, I love this city. Now, not culturally what it had to offer, although that was part of the appeal, but it was the music. My connection with cities at that moment in my life was, what can they give to me in terms of music? So I had a little bit of a comfort level. I went back then, maybe the next summer. I went over for a couple of weeks, to buy records. And, I don't remember going to see any gigs that time, but, just you're absorbing London. And then I was in a band briefly. We went to England for a bit of a time. So I spent a bit of time in London. And then I worked for Virgin when they opened the mega store in Dublin.
Okay.
I thought, this is kind of cool. Like, I finished my degree. I started some kind of master's in marketing and management. But then Virgin Megastore opened and I worked there. I thought, this is great, but I don't want to work in a shop my whole life. And I went to the Reading Festival in 1989. New Model Army were playing, the Pogues, Les Negres Fur. I didn't go the first day, went the second 2 days, and I didn't come home.
Okay.
Like I loved it. I thought, this is my chance to see a load of bands, and I met some friends from Dublin there, that we said, oh, I'm going over, Stroll, let's meet up. And they said, you can stay with us. And my friend Eugene, his younger sister, I was with them for a little while. And Orla, one day, his younger sister, said, but do you want to work for a week at my job? There's a vacancy. Someone's got a cheap flight and they've gone with no notice. So do you want to be a temp And that was at Virgin Records. She worked
Okay.
for the label. I thought, of course I do. And I worked there for a week. It was probably one of the greatest weeks of my life, up to that stage, because I was, surrounded by people who were actually spending their entire day and sometimes their evenings as well with music. And, and also because I was in London, like my vision was, okay, if I'm in London, I was in my 20s, I thought, I just want to see every single band that I can.
Yeah.
So that's what we did. And my housemate, Eugene, and Orla, none of us drank. We weren't drug people. And I think it was that people like me sometimes have an impulse to go deeply into something. And it was music for me. And I was with people who enabled that passion, because it was, okay, what do you spend money on? Food, but just enough food to fuel you. But then you spend all of your money and all of your time on music.
Yeah.
So literally it was kind of a really, really odd night where we'd be at home.
Yeah.
And we put on the television with things like, how are we sitting watching television when we're in London?
Yeah.
Because it honestly was, find a gig, go to a gig every single night that you can. And Eugene was a total devotee, like me, of American hardcore. And then of, that wave of British, it wouldn't be called punk, but it was post-American hardcore British music. So just going to gigs all the time.
Yeah.
My dream. And then I worked at Virgin for a week. Fantastic week. I think on the Wednesday or the Thursday, the head of the international department where I was temping said, "Oh, does anyone want to go? Like, have a spare ticket for tonight?" And everyone said, no, like I'm busy. And really, really decent. He said, "Michael, do you want to go?" And I'm thinking, he's gone to a gig. But I didn't know who it was there.
Yeah.
He said, "Oh," and he might have, maybe, it's just probably everyone else knew. And I just didn't. He said, "Oh, I have a spare ticket for tonight. So I want to go and all this." "Oh, I can't. I said, "Michael, do you?" I said, "Yeah." And it was The Who playing in Wembley.
Wow.
And I was closer, because it's the record label.
Yeah.
So I'm closer during the gig to Pete Townsend than he is to Roger Daltrey.
Yeah.
And would I have paid 50 pence to go and see The Who? No.
Yeah.
Because I would have thought, oh, like maybe Das Damen or, maybe Firehose, that's where I'm spending my money. Yeah. But it just in terms of an education, sometimes you're getting an education, Aaron, even if if you're not pursuing it,
right,
just by being exposed to things. So I worked there for a week, greatest week of my life, and then was happy. And at the end of the week, Chris Griffin, that gentleman who I went to the gig with, said, "Michael, thank you so much. It was great having you work here. We wish we had a vacancy, but we don't." I said, "Oh, thank you. That's really nice to say that, but I had such an amazing experience." I thanked them. I'm polite. And he said, "But we don't want to lose you." What does that mean?
Yeah.
And absolutely beautifully, generously, serendipitously, he said, "So we'll pay you until a vacancy comes up." Now, I'm a guy who wouldn't have applied to be a postman for a record label, because I would have thought they'd say, "You don't know London, like who do you think you are?" Like I wouldn't have had the confidence to apply for a job beneath the lowest entry level position in the music industry. And here's a major label who's saying to me, "We don't want to lose you because we liked you and we thought you fit in. So until a job comes up, we'll pay you and we'll set you up in all of the other departments. So when the job does come up, you'll really understand the record label." Aaron, for a guy like me, like, what are the chances that would happen?
Yeah.
But you can imagine the difference that would have made in my life and my self-perception. And in supporting the belief that I have that the most important thing in my life is going to see bands. and listen to records. And, it was that period. It was also, keep in mind what 1989 meant in terms of popular music and its history. So Eugene and myself and some other Irish people, and this would be a great, I wish you could document this. We're at the School of, what's it called? School of African and Oriental, School of Oriental and African Studies.
Yeah.
For the Nirvana gig.
Yeah.
And, I'm standing there thinking, this is incredible. It was Nirvana and Tad and an opening English band called the Catamaran. And I see my roommate, like my housemate,
Yeah.
floating through the air because Eugene has climbed up to the top of the PA stack.
Yeah.
And has done a stage dive, not a stage dive, a PA stack dive.
Yeah.
So, and there were a lot of other young Irish immigrants at that particular gig. And I think that we think, okay, bands go and play in London and that's where they find their audience and they make money and it gives them a market. But I think that the Irish haven't been counted in what we as music goers, when we're abroad, have brought to music scene. So, I'm going to see all of those gigs. Then I saw Nirvana in the Astoria shortly after that. And I'm just, the Fugazi gigs. Obviously, I'd seen Fugazi in Dublin before I emigrated and, go and see them in places like Brighton, go and see Fire Party. I love the Senseless Things and Mega City 4. So, it's like, how can we see No Means a No?
Yeah.
And Eugene and Orla, they were up for, where are we? What gig are we going to tonight? And it wasn't to sit in the pub drinking. It was, I don't know if this is post-rationalizing it, the post-burnout rationalization. But, it was just, how can we spend as much time as possible absorbing music and consuming music? So it was an extraordinary time to be in London, consuming music, but getting paid.
Yeah.
And working at a record label where they say, oh, the new, Virgin, where Caroline was distributing the Bad Brains record. And it's like, oh, Michael, it's in the warehouse. Do you want a copy? It's like, of course I want a copy. But you're getting records that are really important here for free.
Yeah.
Now, you're exposed to a whole load of crap. So I was exposed to Lenny Kravitz and all of that.
Yeah.
But you get to see people in small clubs, and that's kind of interesting. And you think, okay, I'll get out quickly and I'll go and see some hardcore band in the Marquee or the George Roby.
Yeah.
So I started working for a major record label purely because of the Dublin DIY scene. That's how it worked. I knew Eugene from going to gigs. He was a lovely guy. I'd nodded him. I'd never ever had a cup of tea with him. I'd never sat down with him. I'd never been in his house. He'd never been in mine, the same with his little sister. And yet they gave me this absolute life-changing, literally, sounds stupid, but life-changing opportunity. I'm working at Virgin for a few months and then I'm headhunted.
Yeah.
The guy off the Stena line. And I'm headhunted by another record label that's been started by a guy called Terry Ellis, who was the IS in Chrysalis Records. So he's the guy who had managed Jethro Tull. So what? I thought.
Yeah.
And then he founded Chrysalis Records, and he was explained to me as he's the guy who discovered Huey Lewis in the News. I thought, okay, so what? And Pat Benatar.
Yeah.
Thinking, okay, so what? I actually felt sorry for him. And then they said he's the guy who brought Billy Idol to America. I'm thinking, okay, I like a couple of verses of what Billy Idol has done over 4 albums.
Yeah.
But I love what he did with Gen X before that. And there's even Gen X in the Billy Idol persona. And then they said, and he's the guy who signed Blondie. And that stage, I thought, I really want to meet this guy. So I met with him. He offered me a job. It was funny. Like, it's funny. Like, sometimes really unconfident. Is that a phrase?
Unconfident.
Unself-confident.
Yeah.
Uh,
Lacking
People
confidence.
lacking in confidence,
Yeah.
like me, you can still say no to stuff. Here's the great lesson. If you lack confidence, you can still have values, or you can still appear, to be desirable.
Right.
So he offered me a job and said, we don't really know each other, so let's just go and see. Like, I'll work with you, and let's just see if we could get along, because you're starting this label. And long story short, I do end up working for him, and he signs Henry Rollins after a huge battle. That says a lot about how major labels work. Huge battle. He's passed on Rollins, and we're crushed because we really wanted to work with Rollins. But then he eventually, for personal reasons, Rollins gets signed. And so, Aaron, I'm this guy from Dean's Grange.
Yeah.
And now I'm sitting beside Henry Rollins on a plane, and I've got my position, my job is placing me in the context of being able to help him, or be a functionary in some way.
Yeah.
And now, he didn't like me. He thought I was an idiot, but he's quite
opinionated.
He's opinionated. But and that was just initial, because I clearly didn't make a great impression on him. But then, like, once he took to me, it again, talk about, you meet people in your life who change your life. And Rollins, for me, was incredibly important in giving me insight into kind of a work ethic, into a way to be efficient, a way to be creative, time management, but also into a generosity of spirit from someone who you think, oh, they're totally self-centered, and judgmental, and opinionated. That those people can often turn out to be some of the kindest, most caring, and lovely people. And that he showed that side to me. And it was, the Americans use phrases like humbling, but that's one where, okay, that's what that phrase really means. I'm a guy from Dean's Grange who once hand painted, because I couldn't have afforded a Black Flag t-shirt. I once hand painted with my Dungeons and Dragons painted a white t-shirt and wrote Black Flag on it that I made for my friend for Dexys, Mick McCahan, because he loved Black Flag. And I get to talk to this man, and he tells, he says, Murph, have you heard Eric Dolphy? No, I've heard the name. Oh, Murph, got to check him out. And he goes through, here's the stuff. And he totally took me under his wing and educated me for whatever reasons. He saw something in me, and it was, that meant so much, Aaron. There's a part of me, it's a long time ago, but I still almost can't believe that I was that person, that happened to me, to someone like me. So I worked in London for Virgin, and then this new label, Imago, moved me to New York and paid for me, and gave me a credit card, said, anytime you want to go and see a band, go and see them.
Yeah.
You're like, what if they're playing in Madrid? That's fine. I was this is a job. And then I got the tour with the Chili Peppers on the Blood Sugar Sex Magic tour of Europe, with the Rollins band.
Yeah.
Which
was, I think, their first time actually in Ireland, if I'm correct.
The Chili Peppers?
No, it was the Rollins band's first time.
Rollins band, okay, that makes sense. The SFX.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't do the Irish leg of it.
Okay.
2 nights of the SFX, that makes sense. And just to be doing that, to be talking, to become friends, genuine, to become friends with some of the Rollins band, well, it was just, you're pinching yourself, but you're also living in the moment, and you're also conscious of, I'm just who I am. No one has taught that oh, this guy Murphy is a phenomenal sound engineer, or he's an amazing songwriter. Like I'm bringing nothing. I'm literally bringing nothing to the table, except I love music and I try to be a good person and I try to be a decent person and I try to be straightforward.
Yeah.
So, you know, those experiences absolutely, were so meaningful in my life.
There's two
But,
things. Sorry.
and they happened purely by circumstance rather than through ambition or through a process.
There was two avenues I wanted to go to with that. One was you were talking about like going to see like the Who and seeing artists for the first time who you otherwise wouldn't kind of like seeing. I actually remember one time you were telling a story about the time, I think it was 89 as well, when you went to see Neil Young for the first time and you were kind of like sort of irreverent and you were like, oh, like this stupid hippie, but then you were blown away. But I was thinking like nowadays, you think kind of like with the pricing of concerts where even like mid-sized kind of venues now are getting like kind of very expensive like ticket sales like do you think like it kind of maxes people out from being able to take a chance on music that they mightn't be able to see?
Yeah. Okay. Rewind because that's I was hoping you wouldn't bring up my, my hideously narrow view on life. But absolutely. So I went to see Neil Young. My friend Willard was going to see Neil Young, said, I'm going to get a ticket for Neil Young. Do you want to take it? I'm thinking, no, not really. But I said, yeah, actually, I'd like to go and see him. And I hope I probably said the word stupid because I was an unpleasant person, totally narrow-minded, totally focused. So I might have said things like stupid hippie and, that's shameful now. It's
That
funny.
might be my editorializing
No,
of
no, no, no. But
it.
I'm gonna, again, as the Americans say, I'm going to own that. But so I was going out of a bit of badness.
Yeah.
I thought I'll go and see Neil Young's a hippie. The hippies came way before the punks. He's not going to be around much longer. And look at me. I'm the guy who'll be able to say, I saw Neil Young and he sucks.
Yeah.
That really was my narrow-minded, hate-fueled punk rock personality. And I went and luckily there's a good outcome to this story because I went and I thought, dude, check yourself. Because it was as good a gig as I'd ever seen. And it was that kind of Neil Young almost solo. So it wasn't full band, it wasn't full crazy horse, and it just was as engaging as any, not quite at the Fugazi level, let's be honest, but
Yeah.
it was as engaging as any other gig that I went to. And Aaron, I'm glad you brought that up, even though it's embarrassing and shameful for me. But because it really that was a big dawning for me was that it's not all about August 1976. That's where it begins. It really forced me. And luckily, Eugene and Orla were really, really open. And, if there wasn't a hardcore punk gig, it's like, well, we still have to go to a gig. And I went like to this, I still don't even remember where it was, like some weird hotel at the end of some really obscure train station. I think it was beyond the London Underground. And it was to see Sid and Billy Griffin. Thought, okay, Eugene, you're going to a gig. Well, that's what I do. And there were musicians who'd played with Elvis.
Yeah.
And they were playing like to a bunch of now people who would have skinned me alive if they knew what a narrow-minded punk rocker I was. It was a bunch of Teddy Boy 1950s revivalists who brought these, and that was incredible. Then lucky I discovered world music, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, Pakistani music became a very, very an area of very deep passion for me. Soul music, Motown, disco, great pop. So lucky I was expanding, but 1989, I was that guy off the boat thinking, yeah, I'll just go and see all the new bands because new bands are cool. And Neil Young, he's old. So absolutely, that was pivotal. And bizarrely, I then needed a favor from Neil Young. Like, who who in life, gets to that is where an artist of mine, I was mentioning a guy called Randy Bachman,
Yeah,
who had been in Bachman Turner Overdrive and the Guess Who. I think he was on The Simpsons.
yeah.
Um, and he Neil had guessed it on his album that he'd made himself, because Neil had really admired Randy when he was growing up, and Randy had helped Neil in Winnipeg when Neil was starting out, and the Guess Who were slightly more established, well, a
Mm.
lot more established. And I needed a favor from Neil Young, and his manager couldn't have been more decent. So again, I love music, as you know, like I'm obsessive about it, and I see it as a way for people to connect. And that connection can begin if you really stick close to your genre. If you find your tribe, you'll have a great time. Because if you love New Model Army, like if I was in India and I saw someone wearing a New Model Army t-shirt or hat, I'd probably say, "Hey, how's it going? Oh, you like New Model Army? I
Yeah.
like that." So do I. So I think if you're in your genre, you can meet people that might educate you. And then if you're outside, if you're trans genre,
Hmm.
that's genre and generic. Are they trans generic? But if you're a multi-genre person, maybe you'll meet even more people.
Yeah.
So I really feel that now for me, insular person, introverted, shy, quiet person, that music can open you up to far more of the great things in life, the opportunities that life can present you for comradeship and sense of community. And I'm shocked that you've mentioned the ticket price thing, because it's something I've thought about a lot recently, and I've been interviewed, but it's only in the last 2 days there that my views around ticket pricing have become very, very crystallized. And I've decided that I'm going to become, whatever damage it does to me, I'm going to become a very, very public advocate, now as public as I can reach, for affordable tickets, for transparent, in fact, even more for transparent ticket prices. Because I think if we make pop culture, which is often the first cultural form that young people connect with, if we make that the province of the elite, I think we're going to damage civilization. Now, that's as grandiose, as silly as that sounds. I genuinely think that if we take that away, if we make concert tickets, if we carry on, you might notice, but I was on television this week on prime time,
Yeah.
talking about ticket prices. And I kind of felt, well, I need to be the middle. I'm someone who's researched the music industry and written about it. So I thought I need to be quite fair. But they brought someone who's the former head of Ticketmaster Ireland. And he said, dynamic ticket pricing is here to stay. And dynamic ticket pricing is where you don't know the price of the ticket. It goes to an auction.
Yeah.
And I wish that I had the intelligence or the reactive abilities to have said, hang on, dynamic ticket pricing is not here to stay if I've anything to say about it. And I believe I speak for a lot of music fans there. So this idea of auctioning the tickets, where does that end? Do we go back to the 1800s, to P.T. Barnum, who auctioned tickets for Jenny Lind when she toured the States? Do we go that the great John Lennon, this might be my favorite John Lennon line ever, is where he was playing a Royal Command concert with the Beatles. And he said, "Oh, can everyone in the cheap seats clap along to this song? And for the rest of you," and he pointed up to the Royal Box, "will you just rattle your jewelry?" But are we going to allow popular music to become the playground of oligarchs and multimillionaires at the exclusion of the rest of us? Now, I personally don't care what the ticket price is. If Bruce Springsteen, if the tickets are $1,000, I genuinely don't care. I might even pay that if I love the artist enough and it means enough to me. I've no judgment about people who will pay a lot of money to see concerts. But what I do absolutely find objectionable is this secret auction that people get after waiting on the phone for 3 or 4 hours.
Yeah.
What I completely object to is the opaque way that tickets are sold by Ticketmaster. Ticketmaster are brilliant at this, and they do lots of things really, really well. But they sell tickets in different segments. The first is the pre-sale. Now, it's not announced how many tickets are on the pre-sale. And it really matters if it's 10% or if it's 90%, because it means that number of tickets are no longer available for the second sales event. And guess what that is as well? That's another pre-sale. And the first one might be for the sponsor of the venue.
Yeah, no,
That's
with Tree a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, if you've done a deal with the telephone company and a certain number of the tickets go, I think that if you're putting on a licensed public event, you should have to state what percentage of the tickets are no longer available for the ordinary punter.
Yeah. And
then the second stage might be for the band fans, or there might be things to be for MCD, kind of account holders.
Yeah.
And then the third sales event, guess what that's called?
General sale.
It's called tickets on sale.
Yeah.
But we don't know how many tickets are on sale. And that drives up the price because suddenly they're a rarer commodity. And they've also been depicted in the media as much, 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 much more desirable because we've heard about these other two events. And then with Coldplay, there was this ill-defined at the time fourth event where affordable tickets would be made available for maybe €20. It's like, are there 2 tickets?
Yeah.
Or are there 10,000? Because the difference really, really matters. So I don't care. I'm actually not campaigning for affordable tickets, but I am campaigning for transparent. People should know what they're actually bidding for. And now I have been guilty of this because when I've spoken in the media, I've said, this dynamic pricing model, we've seen it in the hotels and we've seen it on airlines. And it's actually a false equation. Because if I buy a ticket to fly to London from Dublin in 12 months' time, Aaron, I'll get it really cheap. Now, there's a good reason for that. Because if the airline has my ticket for 12 months, they know the demand for that particular flight. They can also, if they're smart, they can invest that money or they can get interest on it. But they don't sell the tickets in these separate moments where, okay, pre-sale, we're selling the tickets for Dublin to London and we're not going to sell all of them and we're not going to tell you even how many we're selling.
Yeah.
Because that distorts the market. And we've fallen, and I'm part of trying, in an effort to try and explain what was happening in the music industry, I cited those 2 examples, and now the music industry is citing those. But they're actually a total false equation. And you can't compare a cultural experience with an hour on a Ryanair plane. And the other thing is, will you pay a load of money if you book a flight for a flight that's taking place tomorrow? Of course you are, but I've kind of got an understanding of why that happens, because if the airliner thinks, okay, that plane's half full, you need a certain amount of crew. But if it's completely full, maybe you need more staff. If you're playing in the 3 Arena or whatever it's called this week,
right?
If you're playing there, there's no financial difference to the show that you put on based on the number of people at the gig and what they've actually paid.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that if the artist If you want to sell a portion of the seats for £1,000, do it. Do it. I will totally endorse that. But don't have someone sitting beside someone else who's bought a ticket at face value, and then someone else who's been sucked into this. Sometimes it's an accidental auction.
Yeah.
Where people bid against each other. I also then will say, if the music industry gets away with that, theatre is next.
Yeah.
So if you want to see a Sean O'Casey play in the Abbey, will you have to bid against someone? And what I would love to do is for the people who say, oh, it's here to stay, and of course it's we want the money to go to the artist, and this way it eliminates the touts. I want everyone who works in a shop, when that person goes into the shop and they say, I'd like a pint of milk, they say, well, it's kind of getting close to closing, so that's €100.
Yeah.
And they say, no, but it's always €2. Or else to say, okay, this guy wants to buy a pint of milk. Anyone else in the shop want a pint of milk? What will you give for it? Or if you go in, again, same thing. Maybe I should get a better example for the lactose intolerant. If you go in to buy some water in the shop, and maybe you call in advance, say, hi, is that Ben Dunn? Do you have a load of water? Oh, yeah, we've loads of water. And then you get to the shop and you say to them, like, do you have a load of water? And they say, yeah. And said, like, how much do you have? Oh, we can't tell you.
Yeah.
Well, how much is on sale? Can't tell you that either.
Yeah.
What price is it? I'd love to tell you, but we'd have to see what other people are willing to pay. So I can understand why the hotel industry went this way. I can understand why the airlines went this way, but I would say shame on the government if they feel that it's okay for let's not call it the music industry, because the music industry is a whole load of separate industries. But if the people who are instrumental in the live music industry, if they feel this is acceptable, if they get away with it, and I hope that they haven't got away with it just yet. I hope this is just a temporary thing where we're just taking a while to recalibrate.
One thing that I think is interesting is that I find that in this country anyway, Live Nation seems to act as somewhat of a kind of clandestine industry. I mean, they're kind of like have relations with like Festival Republic and MCD. I think they have ownership in, and they have ownership in a lot of the venues across the country, and Ticketmaster itself, where I think they're content to. It's just me speculating, but I think they're content to allow Ticketmaster be the sacrificial lamb that everyone kind of points their ire at, because whenever something happens, like, oh, fucking Ticketmaster, I have to deal with them. I think there are alternative routes, independent promoters and venues try to go through Tickets.ie. Eventbrite is a big one, gigantic, and then you have venues like the National Concert Hall, which just see their own ticketing service, which I think venues used to do prior to Ticketmaster coming into Ireland, actually. I was wondering, do you think there's any way to kind of escape that monopoly? Because I think eventually at some point you're going to want to see a concert at like one of these big events and one of these big venues, and it's like, eventually Ticketmaster is your only option. You can't circumvent it.
Yeah, let's not call it a monopoly, because it's not a monopoly. You've just stated other ways that I can buy concert tickets. But there's a difference between a monopoly, and sometimes monopolies can be very good. A monopoly that works, that has people power behind it, that's great. Like, I'll totally endorse that. So I would hate for us to fall into the trap error of calling something a monopoly and thinking monopolies are bad. Now, historically, loads of them have been bad. But there's a difference between a monopoly and monopolistic power.
Okay.
And if, because I don't want us to get outmaneuvered by people who say, oh, you call us a monopoly and we're not. So we're going to sue you, or, whatever. Sure. However this is going to go, seriously, however this is going to end up. But you're completely right. For a long time, Ticketmaster were very content. It was a brave corporate stance, and I really admire them. They were content to be the bad guy. oh, can you believe that the fees on the tickets I just got the charge. The ticket was €60 and then the charge was 16.
Mm.
That money was going to the artist. There's no way you can tell me that a superstar was going on tour and they were looking at how much they were getting from each ticket, every single ticket sold, and they weren't aware of the amount of money in total being sold on the ticket. So it suited the music industry to have Ticketmaster as the bad guy. But you're spot on. There's far more to this than just Ticketmaster. And now Ticketmaster have agreed to put the service fees up front, which is very interesting because you would have thought they would resist that, but they're now confident enough in their position. And that's no longer the hot topic. The hot topic has become the dynamic pricing model. But there's a long, long way for this to go. And clearly, that what used to be called touting, but I don't want to use the word tout anymore. Mm. I'm going to call anyone who buys a ticket with the idea that they'll resell it at a profit, let's call them speculators. Okay. And that's what people do in the stock market. And to me, one of the outcomes is that if Ticketmaster are the primary seller and they're the exclusive reseller, and we saw this in the Lowlands Festival in the Netherlands earlier this year, you could resell your ticket for up to 10% increase, but you could only do it through Ticketmaster, and Ticketmaster took a piece of that resale. Are we going to end up, and here's a dangerous outcome, 10% is higher than interest rates at the moment. Like if you thought that you could buy a ticket tomorrow for Justin Bieber for €100, mm-hmm. and that there was a good chance it'd be worth 110 if you could get it, why wouldn't you do that? That's 10% return in a day, a week, maybe a month. So you're attracting people into the ticket purchase who've no intention of going to the gig. So you've got a mini stock market. Every single ticket becomes an item that's traded on the stock exchange.
Right.
That puts us culturally. Now it's okay if they're for product X, I could care less. But if you're asking me to be comfortable with that for a cultural experience in Ireland, mm-hmm. which is allegedly a country that celebrates its music heritage and its culture, I'm drawing a line with that. I'm saying that's absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah,
and that's one possible outcome of this.
Do you think the government is actually in a position to regulate this? Because I actually think you see in the United States, it was a recent Taylor Swift tour and brought a lot of like actual court scrutiny on to Ticketmaster's operation, Live Nation's operation. I actually did last year, would have been the springtime of 2022. I did an interview with various people of the live music industry. I interviewed the CEO of Tickets.ie and the manager of Whelan's and various like artists and stuff about the response, the COVID-19 response, and how people were getting paid out. And the understanding was, even though it was kind of coming from an altruistic place of trying to make sure people were compensated for the income they lost during that time, there was just kind of a fundamental like lack of understanding of how the live music industry worked. I was thinking, do you think the Irish government is really in a position to actually adequately address this issue?
Well, you mentioned that the States. In the States, it's become a very, very political issue and a very party political issue. And the Democrats in various states are certainly looking at Ticketmaster and their practices. And one of the things they're requesting and potentially going to legislate for is that idea of if you're selling tickets for an event, you have to state how many tickets you're actually selling. Because it's totally influential on your chance of getting a ticket and, as we're seeing, on the actual price of the ticket. The pushback from Garth Brooks, from Irvin Azoff, who managed the Eagles, who might have been CEO of Ticketmaster or Live Nation, is that, and this is how political it's become, where they're saying openly, Joe Biden doesn't like music,
Hmm.
doesn't like music fans, doesn't
Right.
like musicians. And they've brought in someone who was appointed Attorney General by Donald Trump, who's naturally saying that as well.
Mhm.
So they're kind of betting that you'll have Republican legislators, Republican governments, and they will allow ticket pricing to be as dynamic, to be as much of an auction as possible. And they're also trying to make the ticket, the actual ticket, a piece of intellectual property.
Okay.
So if you buy a ticket for a gig, you don't own the ticket. You're borrowing it from Ticketmaster if they're the seller and the artist that you're going to see. And that will be a fundamental change in property rights
Right.
and a fundamental change in access to culture. And
Yeah.
this is, they're advocating this right now. So you're about to see the biggest change that any of the music industries have experienced, I think, in a couple of 100 years, if this comes to pass.
Do you think that'll
So,
have a knock-on effect on how it works here in Ireland, or do you
of
think
course,
like it would be a separate jurisdiction?
yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And, the EU, like we have to follow EU law.
Yeah.
The Irish government are limited to some extent. And if
Hmm.
you're asking me, do I think the Irish government can do anything? I'm saying yes, but I don't know enough about governments and the law yet. But if you ask me that again, I will go away and research more.
It seems that like currently, like I know the Irish government seems a lot more in recent times a lot more favorable to kind of like free marketeer politics and stuff. So it's hard for me to imagine a scenario in which the government, unless their hand is forced, like by the EU or something, would really be too I don't know too inclined to get involved. That's just my opinion, though. Um,
And that's all it is.
it's just my opinion.
That's all it is.
I want to talk.
I have to go soon, but
Yeah,
we could resume. Like if I don't know if we haven't even talked about the book.
yeah, I
Um,
know. It's
it's
such a good
brilliant.
conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
absolutely. I
thank
would
you.
love to resume if you'd be able to and actually get onto the book then.
Yeah, have you read the book?
Yeah, I've read it. Yeah, I finished it.
Did you like it?
I
Was there
really
anything in
liked
it
it.
for
Yeah,
you?
yeah. There's a lot that I wanted to get
I know
into.
that's. I know it's hard. The author says, "Did you like my book?" But
Yeah,
like, was there anything in there that you thought, oh, I didn't know that? That's useful to know.
yeah. There was one actually I really wanted to highlight. Actually, was when we were talking about chart sales. We were talking. I was going to ask about the relevancy of chart sales in terms of determining, um, the popularity of an act now in the streaming era. And this was something I actually didn't know. So every 100 digital streams on a paid service counts as one sale, and every 600 on a non-paid service. To me, that seemed like incredibly arbitrary.
Yeah, yeah. Like, I. It's also very dangerous for Ireland. Like, I
Yeah.
think this is. I don't think the Irish music industry is in crisis.
Yeah.
I think it's dead.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Like I literally think it's ceased to exist. I
Hmm.
don't think we have a functional music industry, and we keep on pretending that we do. So that's something I'll be happy to revisit because I think that's a really important one. But I have to go. I have another thing on it
No, that's
at
absolutely fine.
4. But
Yeah, no, absolutely.
brilliant chatting. Gosh, what a
Yeah.
chat! What a great
Uh,
chat.
Absolutely. I'd love to resume this next week if you're free anytime.
Okay, well maybe this time next week.
That'd be perfect. Yeah. Perfect.
That's it.
Yeah.
But drop me an email and we'll check. I should be grand.
Yeah. And sorry about the internet going out. That's delayed the
No
issue.
problem. No problem. Aaron,
Appreciate it.
brilliant talking, and thanks very much for getting the book
Yeah, absolutely. I
and
loved it.
for thinking about it. Okay, talk
Perfect.
to you
Thanks very
soon.
much. See you next week.
See ya. Bye.
So yeah, the last time we were talking, we got to the point where we're talking about like how you got into the music industry yourself. And what I'd like to talk about now is actually what kind of made you interested in terms of wanting to teach as a subject and become a lecturer in the subject and write articles for like peer-reviewed journals on the subject.
I had a great career in the music industry. I genuinely loved it. I was fascinated by it. I was a pretty good manager. Um, I wasn't the worst, wasn't the best. I was somewhere in the mid range, and I made a living, a decent living for a decade or so. You know, but I never intended being someone who was down at the back of the hall in a leather jacket, kind of reliving past glories.
Hmm.
As much as I'm really fascinated by what's happening currently, as well as by the music that was my threshold into the industry. So there came a stage where I thought, okay, I've kind of done everything I'd like to do, where I'd signed a band to most of the majors, to all of the majors pretty much. I'd signed a band to Disney and thought, okay, but I've had a decent run and I'm curious about other things. And more importantly, I want to test myself
Hmm.
because I've spent my whole career, almost my whole life, nurturing, encouraging, developing other people's talent. Now, they were talented people, so it was a pleasure. But it's just not like, what have I got? What could I contribute? And I wanted to write, and I started writing a book about punk in Ireland. I thought that hasn't been covered. The Northern Irish side of things have been really well covered, but there was punk in Dublin and it had a different trajectory. And I just wanted to, and in other cities down south.
Hmm.
And I just started reading and researching and kind of toying with the idea of, could I be a writer? Could I write something? Would I be able to go from start to finish in a writing process? Like that was completely unproven to me.
Hmm.
And I stopped working in the music industry. I came back to Ireland for a festival called Oxygen that doesn't
Yeah.
exist anymore. Sigur Rós were playing, and I thought this is my chance.
Yeah.
A former client, Greiner, who used to, she sang with Bowie amongst many other things. She was playing, and she kind of said, "Michael, come over to Ireland." So I did that, and I ended up staying. I
Yeah.
thought, okay, I'm in Ireland. It's a changed Ireland from the Ireland I left,
Sorry
and
to interrupt, but I'm noticing the pattern then. You go to a festival in England, end up saying, going to a festival in Ireland, end up saying.
yeah, I generally emigrated by accident.
Yeah.
It's a good by going to festivals. That has happened to me. And I came back. It was interesting. Ireland was interesting. Ireland was changing. And I thought, okay, test yourself here. See if you can write here. And I applied to do a master's at IADT
Hmm.
because I was kind of told that you could do your master's and you could study punk rock. So I thought, well, here's my chance. And if there's a thesis coming out of it and it's on punk rock, here's my chance to learn something because the whole humanities side of the education world was something I was very unfamiliar with because my education had been in business and economics.
Yeah.
And yet I was always stimulated by sociology. Um, and I thought that's a great science. Like that's a really meaningful science. So came back, applied to do a master's, had to do a resume. Aaron, I'd never done a resume before
Hmm.
because I'd never ever looked for a job before. I'd run
Yeah.
my own business, or I'd been very, very luckily, I'd been offered jobs
Yeah.
and did it, handed it in, and I hadn't left the grounds. And I got a phone call saying, "Oh, we've just seen your resume. Will you come back in and talk to us?" I thought, oh, will I even bother? I thought I'll probably sign something like I filled it out wrong. I don't like forms. I don't like bureaucracy. I thought I
Hmm.
did something wrong, so I'll just keep walking. But I went back. I went back, and the head of the one of the heads of the department said, I've just seen your resume. Like, would you like to teach here? I thought, like, what are you talking about? I said, oh no, there must be some mistake. I'm applying to do a course.
Yeah.
And brilliantly, she said, well, you would be doing it, but just from the other side. But that's not how education works. But sure enough, they had a vacancy teaching about the music industry
Yeah.
on the arts management degree. It was before the new media studies degree. And I thought, that sounds really interesting. And so I was doing the master's and said, "Oh, you probably need some time to think about this." And I said, "No, I don't.
Yeah.
No, I'll do it. Like, when does it start in January?" He said, "No, no, it starts next week." And so I was in.
Yeah.
Now it wrecked my head. Wrecked my head. It was really, I was so fatigued doing the masters, trying to absorb really a whole civilization's worth of knowledge from the Enlightenment on.
Yeah.
Um, and I was teaching and I enjoyed it. And just my portfolio kept on getting bigger. I taught, I was doing it for myself in terms of the masters. And I, I learned the only thing I needed to learn, which is, Michael, you can't write. You know, and I'm not saying I'm a writer or that I
Mm.
can write well, but you have the ability to go from blank page to completed work.
Yeah.
And then I decided to do a PhD in parallel with kind of increasing the subjects and the modules that I taught in. So that's how I got into academia. It was really through what's called a practitioner. I was someone who worked in industry, and that got me into academia. So I've got that kind of practice side of things. I'm not a pure academic. I'm not a. I don't. I, I don't feel I'm on the same level as academics.
Well, it's interesting because I remember actually reading one of your essays that you wrote for the Journal of Punk and Post Punk. I was actually using for I was for a legitimate citation, and I remember being very impressed by how kind of meticulous your research was. I believe I can't remember the full article now because it was a couple of years ago, but I remember like you were talking about this kid who bought the first Public Image Limited album at Roach's stores, and like but the citations were these like really kind of obscure newspapers from the time, and I think you see this in the book we're going to be talking about too. You see like references at the time when it kind of like I don't know. I think your writing is very accessible, but it's also very it's backed up by very extensive details.
You couldn't have paid me a bigger compliment.
Yeah.
And in all honesty, because I do feel that if I have anything to contribute, if I'm going to put up my hand and say I'm going to write about this topic, I, it's Aaron, you'll understand. Like, this is, you can't listen to Joe Strummer or Henry Rollins
Yeah.
or Ian McCoy and really get or feel that you're getting what they're saying and not want to be disciplined and meticulous and the best that you can be.
Yeah.
And I I feel that I can only do so much, but my genuine aspiration, again, this comes from punk, from whomever. You understand the references if I mention Crass or
Yeah.
Flux, that we only have so much time. Our time is very limited. But if we can leave a trail, not of, hey, look what I did when I was alive, but this is stuff that I discovered that I thought was worthwhile. And maybe there's only one sentence in it that intrigues you, but here's where I got that. Here's my reference. Here's my citation. So it's an invitation for people at any stage to go back and to learn and to see where I got my information from. So
Yeah.
that honestly, there's no bigger compliment.
Well, I
So
want.
thank you. I'm humbled. Humbled.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, I think through that kind of like as we're talking about that kind of didactic approach to the music industry, of trying to engage kind of students in terms of like saying like you guys can do this too. Like it's not an exclusionary kind of field. I think like for me, I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for you, legitimately, because like I remember I was
Oh,
writing a fanzine for your for the first year of your module actually, and like that you were kind of like, oh, you should like apply to do like music journalism because I want to do writing anyway. And I just like, okay. And I sent out some stuff and, it snowballed kind of from there to the point where I'm doing this. I know at least one other person kind of for a time, I think before COVID, was kind of managing a band, one of uh, my students, because I think because the influence of you. And then I remember also like, one time you brought like a secondary school student into the class and you let him perform in the lecture hall, in front of the students. And I think like there's this real kind of altruistic approach to what you're doing. I think it's what makes you very appealing as a lecturer, and why kind of you're so revered is that it's on top of just teaching people, it's also kind of paying it forward in a way.
Again, I don't know. I can't answer that.
Okay.
I don't recognize that. I aspire. Um, and again, that's really humbling to hear. That's incredibly nice. But what we need to do is rewind, and if you think that I'm good with references, you're still the student who put the highest number of references in any piece of work that I receive. So,
I think that was from McGonagall's article.
Yeah, kind of goes both ways.
Yeah.
In terms of the acknowledgement, or kind of saying, gosh, that's a great method. Am I at that level, or is that, kicking me in the ass? Which is great, or reality check.
Yeah.
But again, if you saw something in me that you thought was altruistic, and you mentioned that paid forward, it literally is just me tapping into a small amount of what I gained from listening to Fugazi, or The Clash, or New Model Army, or any of the bands that have lit a candle for me and have laid a path. And there are hundreds of them. Dexy's Midnight Runners, believe it or not, I still think that they're one of the greatest punk bands. Now, they wouldn't want to be called that. Punks wouldn't want them in that category. But I just think that for people of my age, if you were noticing what was going on at that moment and it was attractive to you, I really think that there were so many lessons to be gained from punk. Now, you could be listening to the same records as I was listening to and get something completely different. But anything that you said about me that I find hard to take genuinely, but I'm also thinking that person sounds great. Came from the goodness, the pureness of art, the drive, the energy, the ambition, and not personal ambition, but the ambition to make the place a little bit better that I got from the music that I consumed.
It's funny because you're kind of reminding me, as you're saying that, like I did once did an interview with Mike Watt, and he kind of said like a very similar thing. Like he was like, what? Because I was saying like, you play with a lot of bands, and like, there's so many projects you have. Like he's like 1,000,001 projects at a time, and I was like, you're still kind of like taking time out of your day to do like projects for like smaller, younger acts. It's like, well, yeah, what are you gonna do? Like, you're gonna get famous and then just like pull up the ladder behind you. It's like, no, you want to kind of help and foster them people. You know what I mean? And I thought like that is the kind of, it's funny because like punk rock I think has this kind of attitude of being potentially exclusionary in a kind of rejectionist sort of way, but really, I mean, you look at the networks of punk that exist, to say in Europe, where you had these kids taking over these like government funded spots and just making like the famous one I think is the arena in Vienna, but just throughout the continent there's like all these like really great venues that exist in the United States. Of course, with the hardcore movement, there became this network, what was it, like Book Your Own Tour or something like that. It was like this book, it was like a reference point of venues, of contacts and stuff. And you see it in Ireland. I mean, in fact, to bring it to your book, Sounds Irish Acts Global, there's in the chapter about U2, you kind of go like, well, yeah, U2, the history of U2 is kind of dictated by, they went to London and they got signed with Island Records, but, really it was the kind of Irish punk network that really helped them. It was like Hot Press to help fund them. It was, their trips to London, it was this kind of network. So yeah, it's something that, I think still exists. I think you still see that kind of network of punk, especially in kind of DIY scenes. And I think now it kind of expands beyond punk. I think you see that kind of, I think everyone's sort of doing DIY. A lot of indie artists now are doing their kind of DIY stuff, and they're able to have a successful career doing that.
But again, you're part of that legacy, so it's not on me. It's on you. You're now. And if you're telling me that you're interviewing me today, but you interviewed Mike Watt, like I don't want to end this call now because it's okay. How great is my life if someone who talked to Juliana Hatfield or the Mike Watt,
Yeah.
thought that I was worthy of spending some time with. But I think you're spot on that DIY thing extends beyond punk, but I genuinely can't, and I've searched. I can't think of a better example of a movement that propelled itself by DIY, but also then left a legacy not of, hey, we're amazing, we're DIYers. It's, hey, this is what DIY is. How can you apply it to your life?
Yeah.
And you mentioned the arena in Vienna. Like I was lucky, I went there and just astonishing. It was, inspiring for me to see places like that I'd only read about before.
Well, let's talk about your book then. So, Sounds Irish Acts Global is your new publication. It's co-written with Jim Rogers. He contributes a few chapters too. Yeah, I was wondering like how you kind of got involved with him and why you decided to bring him on with this project.
The book kind of grew out of my PhD, which was in sociology, and it was a social history of the Irish music industry. And I naively, when I began, I thought, okay, the Irish music industry, what is that? Probably in terms of mass marketing of music, probably goes back to the show bands. Mm-hmm. So I thought, okay, mid 60s, early 60s. I can handle that span of history. But the deeper I went, the more I thought, you can't understand any particular moment, any particular scene, any particular genre without understanding what was around before that, either for that genre to react against or to be supported by, to find maybe people from the previous scene who had a venue or had expertise or had a recording studio. And it just kept on snowballing backwards. And I ended up at the very start of recorded music, which wasn't where I intended to be. So it meant that the book, I'm going to use the word shallow. It's a shallow, it's a stone skimming across a huge lake. So it's not a deep dive into any particular moment. But I wanted to show that really important moments had things that we've forgotten about that aren't part of our cultural or our music industry history. And that's where I began with the PhD. And then I did the PhD. My external supervisor was the most intimidating person. For me to have looking at my work, and it was a guy called Dave Lang who sadly it died, and he was the music industry theorist that I was most influenced by, and most admired. And he'd written about punk. He did the classic book, the early sociological book on punk was Dave Lang, but he also had written for music publications, Music Week, and some of the Inklys. So he was a guy who was in both worlds, academia and the real world. So I was thrilled that he was going to, if you write a PhD, two people read it, your supervisor and the external supervisor. And I was a bit daunted, but I was also just delighted. I thought, if he reads it, great job done. And he did, and he was very, very good, very, very encouraging. He said, okay, Michael, you've done this. Now we need to get it published. I said, really? And I thought, okay, that's a really nice thing to say as he's leaving to go back to England. But sure enough, he got in touch with me a couple of weeks later, said, yeah, I've talked to the publisher that I think would be really good, and they want it. So I had the opportunity to turn my PhD into a book. And my PhD went up to 1985 deliberately because I felt that was an era defined. And it was, almost 100 years of history. It was a lot of history. And he said, but you would have to bring it up to date. I thought that's going to be the same amount of work again. And I thought, I'm flattered that you think it should be a book. I want to honor that. And I looked around and I thought there's someone I'd love to work with. And it was Jim Rogers of DCU, because he has the perspective of the Irish music industry is a tiny part of the global music industry. And he understands the trends, the threats, the excitement of the global music industry. He's got a deep knowledge of copyright, of kind of the ownership patterns, what that means for art and for artists. So he was someone I really wanted to work with. And I had met him. I'd met him once and I thought, not only do I think this guy's work is great, he's a great hang. He's a good guy, really interesting person. And I suggested it to him and he said, yeah. And we embarked on it. Now, the book evolved massively during the collaborative writing stage. And I've more chapters in the book than Jim. But to me, it's very, very much a collaboration, because I couldn't have written this book on my own.
Yeah.
So that's how the connection with Jim.
I think it's like, as a former student of yours, I actually feel like I don't know, I could see the kind of makings of a lot of the early chapters in kind of what some of the lectures of your module entailed. Like, for example, I remember you showed us, like you talk about in the book, like for example when Elvis was on Ed Sullivan for the second time, the Little Dairy Singers, and you actually showed us that. So when I was kind of reading it, I was like, oh yeah, like it was giving me kind of flashbacks to the big one. And you expanded on it a lot more in this book. Well, actually, just before we get into that, I guess, like, there's a lot of curation obviously that had to be done, as you were saying, and there's a lot of like like you obviously have to select certain eras. Like you were mentioning earlier, like the show bands. Like the show bands kind of get a passing mention, but it's not like a chapter. It's not a main focus. So how do you kind of go, like, here's what we're going to actually focus on in terms of how kind of the Irish music industry grew, and here's kind of what we're going to not include, because, like, as you were saying, it could just be like a massive tome.
That really could. And I felt that the benefit of a book like this wouldn't be in covering the history and all of the important moments, which would be a great history. Like I'd be the first person to buy that book.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought, given that this is the first serious book-length examination of that 100-year plus, it's over a century of Irish popular music, I thought to pick moments and go really deeply into them. And we deliberately wanted to shine a light where maybe not much light had been shone before. And the show band probably got the smallest amount of space in the book, and that would shock most people who think, oh, I want to read about the Irish music industry. I know a little bit, and so I want to know more about show bands. That's been very, very well documented in books, in multiple books. Yeah. And sometimes, to me, the best book about the show band era is probably the least read one. And it's a forensic analysis that challenges a lot of the assumptions that we have. A guy called Peter Wiedak. Actually, I'm blanking on his first name, but he was from Arklow, show band member, and he just did this forensic. That's terrible. I'm blanking on his first name. But he talked about the finances, the reality, the opportunities, and I thought actually the show band has sometimes been mythologized as being, oh, this huge, life changing, it was amazing, and I'm not saying it wasn't, but I thought, well, let's see the other things, and that's, in a way, it's when you're doing a social history, you're looking at the absences. You're looking at, okay, so that happened, but what did it mean, rather than that happened, and then that happened, and then that happened. So I really was driven by my own curiosity of, well, what don't I know? And I ended up um, finding things. Jim ended up finding things and documenting. I think things that weren't that known, but should be.
Yeah. And one thing I was interested in is also like when you do kind of like talk about for example something that is well documented, like let's say U2. I mean, they're very well documented band. There's lots of biographies. In fact, you reference a lot of them in your text. Yeah, I mean, how do you kind of go about then creating like a unique spin on it and going, okay, this is a well documented band, but here's how I'm going to kind of approach the story in an interesting way.
The U2 chapter grew out of a conference paper that I gave in Cork at an international conference on popular music. And I knew that there's loads of people who don't value U2, who don't find them relevant or interesting, or think that there's too much written and said about them. But I was determined, you've pointed this out already, to look at that scene, that moment, that country, that city, that cultural environment, and what it did to help that band in kind of roughly the first 2 years of their existence. And I was researching it then, did the conference paper, and I was delighted that people who came up there was one, I won't name him, but one of my absolute favorite music industry academics came and said, you made U2 interesting. Like, you made U2 relevant for someone like me.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, that's way beyond what I aspire to, but I was hoping that maybe it'd open a door. And when you study U2, and it's really funny that today they're launching a video and Larry Mullen is wearing a Ramones t-shirt, and it's been written about in the global media as being a punk song and paying tribute to their roots. But, they haven't always said they're a punk band. They have it at various moments. But I really did want to locate it in that punk to post-punk moment in Dublin, because punk was very, very effectively suppressed in Dublin. Yeah. Horrific, sad story of Patrick Coultry, who was murdered, who was stabbed to death at one of the first. It could have been a pivotal moment in Irish culture, and instead it's only remembered. It certainly was only noteworthy at the time because this poor guy got stabbed to death at it.
That was the Radiators at Space, wasn't it? At the UCD Belfield?
Yeah, UCD Belfield, Radiators from Space, but the undertones as well. So this was cross-border.
Yeah.
And, this was such a key opportunity that was lost for Irish culture. So I wanted to put U2 in the context of, okay, maybe you like punk and you don't like U2, but let's look at the actual, at the grit, at the dirty fingernails, at the. Now, when I say industry, I don't mean, a big mechanical industry. I mean people working hard and doing things.
Yeah,
so
actually,
that's where the U2 chapter came out of.
It is interesting when you kind of look back at kind of like Irish punk. I mean, the only sort of the kind of American punk band that I can remember coming here was like the Ramones in '78. I think I can't remember, they either played Cabra or the State Cinema the first time. They played both, but I can't remember which one was the first one. But they played like cinemas basically when they played here. I think Elvis Costello used to play the State Cinema. Like, it was always like they bring punk, and it was like they always had like very strange venues for. I think Patti Smith played the Top Hat in Dunleary actually, which is like a bingo hall. I think the Stranglers played there. Like, there was kind of like the punk scene, and but when it came to kind of like international acts, you get some of the English bands. I think UK Subs would play here, the Damned would play here, New Model Army, as you mentioned, I think played here. I think Ecstasy used to play here. Even they played McGonagall's. I think I remember when I was doing the research for that. But it's like, I think like the Irish punk scene. I remember years ago when I was a teenager, I read a book called Kicking Up a Racket. It was about the story of Syphilus Fingers. And the author, I can't remember his name, but the author of that book basically made the claim that Belfast was kind of the punk city. You had like the Pound Club, you had the Trenton and Bangor, you had the Harp Bar and places like this, and it was very much punk rock. The Outcasts, Syphilus Fingers, Undertone, and so on. Where he was arguing that like because of U2, Dublin was sort of more had a reputation of being kind of like a new wave city, and it was a bit more kind of fashionable and trendy, like the clubs, like somewhere like McGonagall's or something like that, or the Bagged Inn or place like that, were seen as a bit more like trendy and kind of hipstery, I guess. Do you think there's any validity to that?
Yes and no. Now I understand his point. That's why I I'm writing a book about Dublin in 1977 and, and punk and Dublin, like where they connected, where they collided, and what they said about each other. Because I think it's very, very misunderstood, and it's important that we should understand it because so many things grew out of it. And you couldn't be a punk band in Dublin after May 1977. It literally was not an option that was available. Now, the death of Patrick Cooltree was absolutely one of those parts. But the Northern Irish bands, as hard as they had it, they all had more money. You know, the income per capita was bigger up there. They had better gear, they had better guitars, they had better amps. They sounded much better. Plus, then the Boomtown Rats become a band from Dublin who they call them what you want. They were part of the punk conversation, and they're people who will when very, very credible people like John Robb talk about punk singles, they will include the Boomtown Rats. Now, no one's claiming that they were as punk as Crass or the Clash or anyone who's remembered in history as being part of the punk movement. So if you're a punk band in Dublin, you couldn't play, literally, because people would just be terrified. Venues wouldn't allow any band that had even a whiff of punk for a long time after 1977. So it was very, very effectively suppressed. But you had loads of people buying records. And, the point about fashion, new wave, call it what you will, is quite accurate. But I wouldn't like people to think that it lacks creativity, because I'm putting the Virgin Prunes in there. Like if you can tell me that they were, the definitive new wave band, or that they were chasing, fashion, I will heartily disagree with that. So the Dublin scene was very, very different. But you had a load of people buying the records that are now still acknowledged as being the punk records. But there was a sense of distance, and there was a whole load of people getting on ferries and going to see the bands they liked in Liverpool or further beyond. And that's something that Niall McGurk and myself in our benefit books for the Hope Collective. It's really interesting to get Irish people talking about, some of the most important gigs to them. And they're generally some of them are at the end of a long ferry journey.
Yeah.
It's not today's ferry journey, because the ferries now are fast. But it was a serious commitment to go to a country where there was a lot of Irish anti-Irish sentiment. And you would go there, though, because you had to see the band, because it might be the only time you'd get to see the band. So that I could give you another hour on that, on that difference between Northern Irish punk and what was going on down the south. But it's not as clear cut, possibly, as you would think by just listening to the music.
Yeah. So yeah, there's so much ground to cover with this book. I'm trying to make sure that I ask just some kind of some big points. So one question that I think that the book proposed at the beginning that you can't really answer. I think realistically, no one else can really answer this without just speculation. But the question proposed at the beginning of the book is, in the early 20th century Ireland, especially when Ireland gained independence, there was sort of this there was a censorship that was brought in that went over film and literature, to kind of for the most part, it wasn't to curtail images of sex and violence. It was more so just to maintain kind of Catholic Irish hegemony, and to kind of make sure that and no, Kevin Rockett's a great writer on this. I remember reading his book on film censorship, and the whole reason that the censorship was set up was to make sure that people weren't getting kind of like undue influence. But yeah, music, as you mentioned, never had the kind of curtailment. Off the top of my head, I didn't do any research for this. Like I was just off the top of my head, like knowledge I have of music being censored in Ireland. I can think of two examples. One was Chrissy Moore, I believe, in '83, wrote a song about the Stardust fire, and that was for a defamation case, so it got pulled for defamation. And the other example was, I can't remember if it was Penis Envy, but Crass were having one of their records manufactured in Ireland, and the manufacturing company kind of read the lyrics and pulled it and said, we're not manufacturing this. But even then, that's not really a case of state censorship. That's more like a business kind of making a decision. Yeah, and so those are the only kind of two examples I can think of. So yeah, I mean, like, what do you have any kind of theories, I guess? And I guess it really only can be kind of theories as to why music didn't get censored in Ireland.
Your point, you're spot on, and it's a really, really important point to understand Ireland.
Hmm.
We get independence, and it's natural. It's natural in that post-colonial moment, which wasn't seen as post-colonial at that moment, but we had effectively left a situation where we were not in control of our own economy, our culture, our destiny, all of the things that you can as a nation state. So I think there was a very genuine and understandable desire on the early leaders of independent Ireland to want not to be British. Mm-hmm. That was often how we defined ourselves as a country. We're different from Britain. In what way? Various ways. But sometimes in ways that were a bit vague, a bit cryptic. And you mentioned that there was a very, very, it's what's called sacral nationalism, where there was an association with Catholicism and Irishness that othered anyone who wasn't a staunch Catholic.
Yeah. Which is ironic because the Roman Empire never came to Ireland, so we got Catholicism through the British.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And, our national saint, St. Patrick,
yeah,
was kidnapped by Irish slavers. So, there's loads of complications to it. It's never straightforward.
No.
But you're spot on. Like, so books were censored. Cinema was censored. The theater was censored.
Yeah.
Dancing was incredibly censored.
Yeah.
So, we're historically, when you look at it, you can absolutely say, yeah, Ireland was full of very heavy-handed, powerful censorship, repressive censorship. And the deeper I went in to looking at the use of music, the use of recorded music in Ireland, I thought, this is really interesting. And I hadn't ever seen anyone write about it. Recorded music wasn't censored. Now, as you say, I'd be speculating as to why, but I didn't see. Now, there was a lot of discussion in the 1930s about radio and how perverse it could be and how dangerous, there was the famous anti-jazz campaign. There was this idea that crooning, now even something as innocent to our ears as someone like Bing Crosby, that Irish political forces thought, that's disgusting. Oh my God, like that they really are. And I think that recorded music wasn't ever attacked by the Irish authorities because it was a very, very, very good ally to them. EMI, bizarrely, like one of the most British of British companies, was given the monopoly
Hmm.
on vinyl in Ireland
Yeah.
at the time of a trade war, at the time of anti-British rhetoric, at the time where British ownership of Irish industries would have been very, very, very suspect.
Yeah, we were in a very kind of economically protectionist state at that time. It was like
Yeah,
very much like Irish industry, except maybe for ESO because we don't have oil ourselves.
yeah, yeah. And it was a very dangerous economic policy. It was an incorrect, as we know now, economic policy, but it was tied into that cultural isolation that we have to protect ourselves. But
I
it
think there
was
was
only
also a legitimate attempt to try and build the Irish economy as a self-sustaining thing too, to be fair. Like it wasn't just the cultural protection, I think.
no, and it was an attempt to build economic protection by people who didn't know anything about economics.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
it,
that's
it
fair.
was bound, it was bound to fail.
Yeah,
And it was only when we got Marshall Aid and we had to produce statistics that they realized that there's no possibility of this country being self-sufficient. It,
right.
it doesn't have the raw materials. Anyway, back to the censorship of the non-censorship of music. EMI released records made by Eamon de Valera. So that's a really, really smart thing for an industry that might be facing censorship to do. The first home generated pop star was married to the director general of RTE, who had been a really, really important force and a fantastic intellect and a great diplomat. He'd been, our ambassador to London and to the Vatican. And how important, those roles would have been.
Yeah.
Kiernan was his name, and Delia Murphy, his wife, became our first pop star, and she's singing nostalgic Irish songs.
So what was her
And
name?
Delia Murphy,
Delia Murphy. Okay.
and that's why we have maybe a hands-off approach. The other huge factor is that one of the biggest pop stars of the first 50 years of the recorded music industry is John McCormack. And he releases songs that are benefits for Catholic charities. He's a superstar, incredibly wealthy. I think the papal nuncio stayed in his mansion when he came to Ireland.
Yeah.
So pop music was a great servant, and I saw that as I did my research early on, and then I thought, and I've invented this term, Catholic pop, for. You mentioned the little Gaelic singers from County Derry. The church was incredibly present in Irish pop music for a very, very long time, much longer than it would have been, or any religious group would have been in other countries. So it wasn't until the punk era that you start seeing calls from ministers, from politicians, for the censorship of records.
Yeah.
And bizarrely, the campaign was against the soundtrack for Monty Python, The Life of Brian.
Yeah.
Which to me was very much part of that punk and post-punk moment in Ireland.
Yeah. But it's interesting actually, you were kind of mentioned briefly, again, it kind of, there's so many avenues to go with this, but you mentioned this censorship of dancing. And one thing that I thought was interesting when I was reading your book, so there was a district justice called Bartholomew Goff, there's like basically an entire chapter kind of talk about him. In fact, he came up in one of your lectures, I remember. There was this interesting thing. So he had this anti-jazz campaign, and basically he couldn't define jazz. He wanted Irish traditional music to kind of go. I think a part of this kind of cultural project that we had going, which was to try and which in some ways I think had benefit, like funding, for example. GA is fine. Like I don't think anyone has an issue with that, but like in other ways, when it comes to there's some ways where like I think that kind of project afterwards was very stifling, and I think this is one of them where it's like, you don't have the option to just enjoy Kaylee. It has to just be that, you know what I mean? And it's like, jazz was, I guess what David called jazz was very popular, which was really just American music of any ilk. And when he was asked to define it, he used the term, like a very derogatory term called jungle music. And he also went into an anti-Semitic kind of rant about it. And I think that's like, it oddly shows the kind of xenophobic nature of a lot of that was underlying a lot of this. And we talk about kind of anti-British sentiment, which obviously was very prevalent. But it's interesting because you don't really think of Ireland as, when you think of like the anti-Semitism of Europe in the 20th century, you don't really think of Ireland as a part of that. I think of the line from Ulysses where they say Ireland was the only country what was it? Ireland was the only country not to basically abandon the Jewish people because they never welcomed them in the first place. And you kind of look back at that, and it's like it seems very rooted in xenophobia that you wouldn't really expect it. And I was actually quite shocked when I read that quote. Yeah, I was wondering if maybe you could talk a bit about Bartholomew Goff and his sort of xenophobic leanings.
I have a lot of sympathy for Bart Goff, for DJ Goff, as I call him, because he was an ardent nationalist.
What was this district again? Sorry, I didn't write it down.
Well, funny enough, Blackrock, but Blackrock County Louth. So Carrickmacross was in his district. So, the area above County Dublin was District Justice Goff's area, sphere of control. Now, I don't agree with him. I need to make that extremely clear. But I see these people aren't in the context of their time. Very, very frightened of the outside world and what that would do to Irish culture. He's very supportive of the GAA, very supportive of any drive to protect Irish culture. But that then comes out in a xenophobia that was quite prevalent. And obviously, our record during the war, where we were neutral, where Eamon de Valera went to the ambassador of Germany's residence to offer his condolences when Hitler died. Things that were really outside of European opinion at that time.
To give the counter argument, though, the Irish Constitution in 1937 did give a special protection for Jewish people because de Valera, the chief rabbi of Dublin had fought in the 1916 Rising somehow. He was friends with them, so I mean there is that kind of counter argument too, just to be fair, I guess.
Yeah, but the counter to that counter argument is the number of refugees we took in.
That's true. Yeah.
So they may have been saying things. They may have been indicating that they understood the situation, but it was okay if Jewish people are over there, but they're not coming here. The most important, and I don't go into this in the book, I mentioned it briefly, the most important music company was run by a Jewish man and his brother-in-law, and they transformed the Irish music industry. But District Justice Goff, there was xenophobia in there. That there was a huge fear of you mentioned basically anything that was American music, and it was, you can look back at it now and you think, how did you think you had a problem with that? But it was just that they were trying to define what Ireland was, what Irishness was, but it came off in this very, very xenophobic, this very protectionist, and also something that was dangerously out of touch with the common people, with the ordinary people who just wanted to dance.
Yeah.
They wanted to go dancing. They wanted to have a bit of a laugh. They weren't being disrespectful. They weren't saying we hate Ireland, so we're going to do a dance that's not Irish. There was huge confusion when they tried to enact, their vision of Ireland will be full of people doing Irish dances. Like, it was not practical. And eventually he had to reverse. from that. But he was, and I have a lot of time, a lot of respect for lots of things that he did, but he was completely out of touch with what was actually going on. And he was making judicial judgments based on hearsay.
Yeah.
Rather than going to see, oh, what are they doing at the dancing? And if he had gone, maybe he would have been shocked by just how nice people were being to each other at those dances. But, part of the Catholic political dominance was that people from outside their village weren't even allowed to dance. Yeah. It was very, very much controlling small groups of people by knowing all of them, knowing what they did, knowing even who they went on a date with. So it was a very, very hands-on, active policing of people, young people in particular, leisure. And then, I was mentioned that my aim was to kind of shine a light at things that maybe weren't part of Irish history that I felt should be, because they were just as important as some of the other things that have become part of the history. And, District Justice Goffey encouraged people in Blackrock, County Louth, to form a vigilance committee. He was very, very restrictive about the type of dancing that people should be doing. And then a couple, a boy and a girl, are caught kissing.
Yeah.
And it's not a local incident. District Justice Goff's treatment of this kiss, a public kiss, but there was nothing more than that. There was nothing more salacious or deviant or outrageous. But the Eamon de Valera and Fianna Fáil had recently changed the constitution so that an offence to morals could be prosecuted. And District Justice took what I am convinced was the test case. And the lad got off, he got fined £2 that he had to give to the Vincent Paul. He was from a good family. The girl, she didn't live in Ireland. And she was sentenced to a month in prison. So she was effectively banished.
Yeah, so she was Scottish, if I'm correct. And the service was, but she was Irish living in Scotland, was that?
Yeah. She was living in Scotland, but I believe that she was, Julia Clark was her name. And one of the things that I want to do now that the book is done, I want a campaign for an amnesty for her.
Yeah.
I don't see why the Irish historical records should include a woman who was sentenced to a month in prison for kissing a guy who then was allowed not to go to prison.
Yeah.
So I'm adamant, but I go to see District Justice Goff's grave quite frequently, and it's very close to John McCormack's grave, which I find very, interesting as well, that one of the great pop stars, an ally of the Catholic Church, is very close to one of the people who really, really suppressed quite an innocent form of pastime, which was communal dancing in communities, in public.
I just want to clarify in case it wasn't clear. She actually didn't serve the month. She was essentially she went back to Scotland. She was told if she would return to Ireland, she would have to serve the month sentence. So effectively exiled. What happened then was a big fallout in kind of international journals from Britain and the United States, where they were kind of essentially mocking Ireland. They were saying like, "Oh my God, this is ridiculous! Like Ireland's like." Victorian approach to this, and it's just like it caused a lot of embarrassment, and in a way I kind of think that's sort of like a very defining moment for a kind of nascent culture where it's like to have that kind of public embarrassment. In a way I sort of think Ireland even today kind of is happy with kind of contentious domestic policy as long as like it's not being observed by outsiders. I think of this is a very weird line, but I think of the line from the Dead Kennedy song, "Soup is good food," where it's like I hate to interrupt, but it's against the law to jump off that bridge. A tourist might see you when you wouldn't want that. You just have to kill yourself somewhere else. I'm just doing my job, And it's like I think it's a very similar approach where it's like, I don't know. And I think that's like the first example of it anyway.
Yeah, you're totally correct. So she was sentenced to a month in prison, but she was told if you leave Ireland, obviously she wasn't going. They weren't going to try and extradite her. It would have been very interesting if they had tried to extradite her.
Yeah.
From Britain to serve a month for a kiss. So she was effectively exiled. She was The message was, we don't want people like you in Ireland. And I think you're right. I think it was a pivotal moment. I haven't seen it mentioned in any Irish history book, but I think the diplomatic embarrassment must have been quite severe. That, you know, this was in Blackrock, County Louth. It wasn't meant to be a national story.
Yeah.
Even if it wasn't expected to be a viral global media moment that reflected really, really badly in Ireland. And I imagine, now I'm not a diplomatic historian, but I imagine that must have reduced the potential oppression that could have followed if they had got away with that.
Yeah.
You know, what would the next step have been if that had got away without any international news attention? So I think you're spot on. I think sometimes countries are quite happy to enact laws or to have laws on the book that maybe aren't even policed, that, you know, with a lot of sincerity. But once it becomes a diplomatic and international statement where people are saying that country is completely out of line, and basically, you know, do the Irish not have a sense of humor? Do they hate women? Do they, like, what is this about? You know, and the comparisons were made to Mussolini at the time. It must have sent a chill to the authorities, and it may have prevented them from doing other things that we would look back and think that they were out of step with contemporary values or even mainstream European opinion.
I'm thinking this is kind of what, sorry.
I actually have to go. But again, you know, that was a great hour, and thank you so much. And we'll pick it up another time if that's
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, absolutely. The same time next week.
Let's pencil it in.
Yeah,
let's
perfect.
pencil it in. Thanks a million.
Thanks, and appreciate it. And yeah, I'm looking forward to finishing this up.
It might be more than the next hour.
Take care,
Okay,
Michael.
take care. Thank you.
Bye. Yeah, so my first question, and it's a bit of a preamble, I'll try to get through it as quick as I can. So the book starts with some interesting discussions about how kind of Irish people, particularly Irish expats, helped in things like copyright law, in terms of residual payments, in terms of live music, in kind of the setting of like restaurants, as well as kind of like how Irish entrepreneurs gave to what was called ethnic music, which was to appeal to expats. So Irish music was under this umbrella term with a lot of music. I'm just going to skip through that section, but it is interesting to note, starting with the 1950s, one thing that is interesting is you talk about Ed Sullivan on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was kind of like the big talk show / variety show of its era. They had Elvis Presley on, and at the time, Elvis was getting a lot of pushback from a certain sect of the Christian right in America. The same people who a decade later would be like burning Beatles records because they didn't like Paul McCartney's haircut. Ed kind of recognizing that, saw himself as someone who was on the kind of pulse of America, of American zeitgeist, and he was trying to appeal to teenagers. So with Elvis, so seeing that, he kind of counter-programmed his own program by bringing on the Little Gaelic Singers, who were these. It was like an orphan group from Derry, and he kind of had them on because they were kind of being embellished by a lot of the people that were so against Elvis. Yeah, I was wondering if maybe we could talk a little bit about like how kind of like, I don't know, the kind of idea of like Irish bucolic sort of primitivism was kind of like a counter to, I guess, like American modernity.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I think it's important to remember the context that in the 1950s, you know, you mentioned the word bucolic, but, you know, someone like Edward Said would have looked at, okay, so what does bucolic get surrounded by? Get surrounded by words like innocent, naive. What are they adjacent to? They're adjacent to words like backward, simple. What's the implication of people who are backward and simple, but innocent and naive and lovely? Now, you might be representing them as quite lovely and admirable in loads of ways. So in a way, those people can be used as a critique of modernity. We've gone too far here in America. There's crime. There are people reading comic books. You don't see the Irish reading comic books. And you had there's a brilliant book called The 10-Cent Plague about the suppression of comic books and the censorship. So at that time, the Irish were very, very, very much part of this representation of the good old days. The way things were, the way things implicitly or explicitly should be. And you mentioned the people who would have set themselves against Elvis, they then, a generation later, would have been people who were anti-Beatles. And then you'll find those people, not the exact same people, but those types of people are then there for punk. They're there for hip hop. They're there pushing back against lots of things, generally things that are concerned with youth culture. So Ireland became an alibi for fair and balanced, to use a very loaded term.
Yeah.
And Ed Sullivan was smart enough to think people are going to hate Elvis, but I want to have him on because he's newsworthy.
Yeah.
And a whole lot of people who might think that I'm a bit lame or I'm a bit old or I represent the older generation, they might think I'm cool, or they might tune in to see what's happening next week.
Yeah.
And the counterpoint of this dangerous rock and roll with Elvis was to put a group of Irish orphans singing religious songs, singing Irish tunes that had ancient melodies. They did the Thomas Moore song, Believe Me, of all those endearing young charms. And then they did this kind of, didn't she dance and dance and dance? This really interesting, lyrically, song about a baby going to dance with the fairies. So it's part Cinderella story, but it's the Cinderella story told through Irish mythology. Yeah. So you're spot on. And the footage, I checked last night and I hadn't seen it before. I own the footage. Well, I own a copy of the footage of that.
You own the rights.
Yeah. I own Elvis. I own a copy of a DVD.
Yeah.
That has the full episode, so you can hear the banter. You can hear how Ed Sullivan introduced the darlingest, aren't they the darlingest little children?
Yeah.
But really, everyone there is just twitching up. We want to see Elvis. But the footage is on a popular video channel where people watch things, and you can, if you just put in Little Gaelic Singers, before no one knew what I was talking about. I obviously, as you can tell from my appearance, like I own the Little Gaelic Singers on records.
You're very
vinyl.
Evangelical about the Little Gaelic Singers, about propagating them.
Yeah, but now you can see the footage, and it's startling, considering that not in the same decade, not in the same year, not in the same city, but on the same television program. Look at what Ireland's got and look what America's got.
And it's an interesting counterpoint because the 1950s becomes this era of like a new categorization of people. So prior to the 1950s, age was a dichotomy between adulthood and childhood. You're either an adult or you're a child. Suddenly in the 50s, it becomes this new category, this kind of autonomous age group called teenagers. This is born out of a kind of capitalistic thing where America is having a great economy post World War II because a lot of American soldiers were able to come home and start spending the money they accrued during those years. So the automobile industry booms, the housing market booms, and teenagers are able to get like not only one but like two jobs, like several jobs. So they might be like, I don't know, working like at a diner during the week, and then like as an usher in the cinema during the weekend, like whatever. Like they have several jobs. And they start spending on pop culture. So they start spending on things like records, comic books, like you mentioned, going to the cinema, even like paperback novels, these kind of things. So the entertainment industry notices like this new all this new income they can get by appealing to these people. So they create kind of stars for teenagers. So I think like of the 50s, like it would be exemplified with people like Elvis Presley and like James Dean, for example. In the 1950s in Ireland, I think it's an interesting counterpoint is that we're kind of going through sort of a transitional period economically because, as you mentioned, I think last week, we've gotten a huge economic kick through Marshall Aid. And, we're going through a transitional period of industrialization, but unlike the Soviet Union, it was like, going to take more than 5 years. So, during that time, it's interesting when you look at it because essentially by the end of the 1950s, Sean Lemass had surpassed Eamon de Valera as the Taoiseach, and he was very much like pro-free enterprise kind of guy. And Ireland was, by the end of the 50s, was very much just embracing kind of Keynesian economics that would kind of influence our culture going forward. This is my question for you. So I read a book by a guy called Kevin Rocket, who's a film historian at Trinity College. And he was talking about when the film Blackboard Jungle was released in Ireland. Blackboard Jungle was like the big rock and roll film of 1950s kind of teenager exploitation films. It starts with like Rock Around the Clock. When that opened in Ireland, I think in '56, there was like, it was massive. There was queues around around the cinemas for teenagers trying to get into it. And he says that even though Ireland didn't have the kind of affluence of the United States at that time, the teenagers in Ireland did see themselves as part of this global push for adolescence, for teenagerhood, as being kind of a separate identity. I want to ask you, because in your book you talk about how the teenagers in the late 70s and early 80s through events like college events and through fanzines and stuff like that, and of course you bring up the Hope Collective as well, kind of influence Irish music. My question for you more so is, when do you think kind of teenagers in an Irish context kind of became a group worth appealing to, or a group that had enough disposable income that they could actually influence pop culture?
1956.
Really?
I'll tell you why. I interviewed a guy called Ted Carroll from Glasstool, who set up Chiswick Records.
Okay.
He managed Thin Lizzy. He funded Thin Lizzy in their early days. He set up some of the first teenage dances in Ireland as a young person, as a contemporary of other young people who didn't have anything to do that they felt represented their culture. So I think teen culture began to percolate in Ireland with rock. I was going to say rock against the clock, but with rock around the clock and with Blackboard Jungle. And what Ted told me is that he went to see it multiple times because he found it thrilling. Yeah. He thought it was really exciting. He loved rock and roll. And there's always been a cultural tension in Ireland between a power group who want to keep things the same. Mm-hmm. It's the definition of conservatism. And then other people who think, well, we don't like the way things are. We want to push back. It's what Gramsci would have called that mutual siege. Stuart Hall would have written about the mutual siege. Things are never settled. There's always tension between different groups in society. Yeah. But Ted told me that the version of Blackboard Jungle that was shown in Ireland was edited. It was cut. Yeah. And it made no sense. So there was a scene where someone's sitting down, and then immediately it cuts to someone flying through a window. I was like, so it must have looked like a Harry Potter film because they literally, it was distorted. It's a clear example of distortion by the Irish censors. But, again, in terms of why do I think 1956 is a key moment in teenagers being invented, teenagers saying, look at us, we want to be our own group. Ted told me something very interesting, that when he was in school in Glasstool, him and his mates had a record buying club where they would pool their money so they could buy more records. And whoever's turn it was this week got to choose the single that was bought. And it was shared. It was this collective record collecting.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I found fascinating was that Ted said that he went to Blackrock Library to read books about jazz. And keep in mind now, in the 1930s, jazz was a dirty word in Ireland. Jazz was a word full of tension. And I find it very interesting that the municipal libraries, founded by Carnegie, funded by Carnegie, but run by the Irish state, had books about jazz that stimulated this young fella who then pursued a whole career and continues. He's just opened a new record shop in his 80s.
Yeah.
You know, this lifelong passion for youth culture and for music of all stripes. So I do think Blackboard Jungle 1956 is really important for Irish culture.
Yeah. And then going on to kind of the 70s then. So at this point, like, we're already on the trajectory of kind of, like I was saying, the kind of economic liberalism that I think Ireland model itself after going forward. What I find interesting is there's a few choices. I want to talk about the curation of what you chose to include in the book, because I think there are two interesting decisions. So the book touches on like a lot of cornerstones of Irish music that I think people will expect, things like U2, Enya, and Riverdance. But the two that I found interesting was when it came to kind of 70s rock and roll, the obvious choice I think is Tin Lizzy, but instead you wrote about Horselips. And when it came to 90s or Ireland's place in 90s alternative music, the obvious one is the Cranberries, but instead you chose the Corrs. I was wondering, like, what kind of influenced your decision in terms of going, I'm going to, write about these artists compared to this artist, yeah?
It's a great question, and it's a question and it's a thought process, Aaron, that sometimes was unconscious when I was researching my parts of the book, and sometimes it was deliberate. But I would say that on balance, it was more unconscious. So the bias in my book is largely unconscious. And, you know, you mentioned the 1950s. To me, it's interesting that you mentioned the 1950s, and then you mentioned the 1970s.
Yeah.
And the great gap in my book, my book with Jim, is the 1960s. I deliberately didn't go in depth. I had written now a lot about the 1960s and the show band era in I guess what was the genesis of this book, my part of the book, which was my PhD. But I thought that in terms of the lessons that might inspire someone in Glenageary or Ballina or Belfast today, I was actively looking for stories of enterprise that was done generally with little or no money, generally with few resources. So I was looking for inspirational tales, and the Cranberries story is really easy to tell from a business point of view. So I thought, well, is there anything interesting in the Corrs, in their self-management, in their self-promotion, in demonstrating how networks work in practice to provide opportunities for people? And that chapter was a bit of a revelation for me as I did the research, because I have to give the people who surrounded that band a huge amount of credit for taking this musical product, because that's what it was when they recorded, and taking it to a global audience. And it wasn't straightforward. Yeah. So again, it pushes back on this myth that, oh, you signed to a major label, you're going to be huge. You signed to a major label, you'll get lots of opportunities. In fact, the reverse is also is often true. So that was part of the thought process, was where are the inspiring business stories that now, and I don't mean business in terms of corporate. I mean business in terms of, well, if you don't like the way things are, what might empower you? What might make you think, actually, I could do that? That's surprising in terms of the small, incremental, and very doable steps that those artists took initially. And again, with Horselips, to me, Horselips, they're not just a musical revolution. they're a complete revolution in terms of enterprise. So here's young guys, smart, young, talented, savvy people who understand Irish culture intimately,
Yeah.
but who also understand rock and roll and counterculture. And they're able to make something that's very, very potent. It's continued to have an influence on Irish music making. But I think that the business story behind Horselips was even more important and has been, I think, under documented.
The interesting thing I think is like when you look at that kind of transition from kind of Ireland from I guess like the traditional music that we're associated with to the kind of more contemporary music is that it always seems like it always ingrains it a little bit. Like you're talking about Horselips and their kind of understanding of Irish music. I was also thinking around that time you also had Clannad starting, and Clannad were doing the trad fusion thing. They were very much inspired by the Beatles and the Beach Boys, and but they're also bringing their trad roots to it. I mean, Tin Lizzy at that time was doing like covers of Whiskey in the Jar, um, like and then the Cranberries and the Corrs, even like there was that incorporation of Irish trad, of Irish kind of uh kind of lyricism and kind of vocal performances. Yeah, I was wondering like why do you think that still kind of resonates throughout the careers of all these like contemporary Irish artists?
It That strain of Irish traditional music.
Yeah,
I, and look at the contemporary scene. Look at Lancome.
yeah, yeah,
Look at the whole cobblestone era of bands. Look at trad rave, which is this full on rave music, but delivered with a huge slice of very curated hardcore
yeah,
traditional Irish music in there. So it's found very, very fruitful possibilities. And you mentioned, you can hear it in Dolores O'Riordan's voice. You could hear it in Sinead O'Connor's voice. They were identifiably part of a singing tradition, the Sean-Nós tradition that goes
yeah.
way, way back. So I think that there has been an openness to traditional Irish music. It was never completely uncool. It was never completely suppressed. It was always available. I think of, I don't know if I mentioned it in the book, but the Radiators. I might have written about it somewhere else, but the Radiators' first album is pure punk. Like it's pure 1977 punk.
Yeah.
But there's a little sliver of an Irish tune snuck in there into the aggressive guitar work. And then what happens? Now, I don't think you can't credit the Radiators, but it's lovely to see that it did begin here, but through the Pogues, Black 47, and then to the major superstars, Dropkick Murphys,
Yeah.
superstars in America, Flogging Molly, superstars, much bigger in the States than they are elsewhere. So I think that Irish traditional music found a way to perpetuate itself that was very, very multidimensional. And obviously people like the Dubliners kept, the ballad singing part of it alive. But I think and maybe there is an urban rural divide traditionally in Irish popular music, and the show bands were quite a rural phenomena. But people in Dublin, people in the cities were still exposed and listening to, and the diaspora were absolutely listening to the Clancy brothers. Like the coolest of the cool, people like Johnny Marr.
Yeah.
Grew up listening to Rory Gallagher and clearly all the great pop music that was coming out of Britain and America. And you started off mentioned by Clannad. Don't forget Clannad recorded with Connie Plank,
Yeah.
who then worked with Killing Joke, who comes from, that whole electronic sphere. So Clannad, and then you did it bigger
Mm-hmm.
and more commercially, but Clannad were not some inward-looking Donegal family band. They were very, very aware of what was going on and what was interesting and exciting.
Yeah, and actually, what's interesting about Clonard is that, like, because we talk, like in your book, you talk about how, like, a lot of times Irish artists have to kind of go to, British labels or American labels in order to get signed. What's interesting about Clonard is that they were signed to a German label. I think Philips Records signed them after the Letterkenny Folk Festival, and it's really interesting, like that. They had huge success in Germany. It was like their biggest market. What I want to ask also is, I won't take up too much of your time. You give me much more than than I would have asked for. I guess one final question I'd like to ask is, for a lot of the events that happened in this book, a lot of them were during your lifetime. Pretty much everything from the '70s up. I was wondering, did you, when you were like just living through these events, did they have the kind of resonance? Did you notice any kind of paradigm shifting or anything like that when they happened at the time, or is it more just a retrospective thing when you look back and go, "Oh, I guess Riverdance was the biggest thing ever. I guess Westlife really did kind of change boy bands in some way."
A great question. You live through things, and you just, especially when you're young, you just think, okay, that's the way life is. That's the way things work. There's a band, I got to see U2 playing in the TV club with Micro Disney opening for them. And I just thought, with hindsight, you think, okay, so I got to see the biggest rock and roll band in the world as they became, you know, playing a gig where Dave Fanning was playing records and was playing Magazine,
Yeah,
so uh, seeing U2 to me is absolutely tied up with seeing Micro Disney and hearing Magazine being played through a huge PA.
yeah,
But you're not looking at those bands thinking, okay, they're going to be the biggest in the world. You can't. No one in the music industry can see that. But you're what dawned on me quite early, Aaron, is that if I didn't support bands by going to see them, because I was going to see small bands, and maybe I might have been 10% of the audience.
yeah,
And if I went to see that band 10 times, then if you stacked all the times I went to see them, I was the complete audience for one of those.
yeah,
And and then you tell your friends who maybe they're not that into music, you've got to see this band, and I'm not really going to see live music. So you should really check out this band. And so you become a bit of an apostle for live music. But no, you absolutely can't see it until it gets reflected by other people. I was living in Ireland when Riverdance, for example, when it took off, but my parents were talking about Irish dancing. I thought, my God, what's happened in Ireland?
yeah,
My parents, it's been a long time since that's been a topic of conversation. We're saying it was so great, it was so exciting. And then my parents bought the VHS and then thought, okay, like this music has a whole lot of power. And it wasn't even on a major label at
yeah,
that stage. So I was thinking, like, you know, I'm kind of a punk rock guy, but I'm an early hip hop guy. I'm, I'm interested in things that are new and interesting and kind of challenge me. I'm always looking for the next thrill in music. But no, at the time, you're not aware. Obviously, I was seeing, okay, so I saw U2 in the TV club, and then the next time they come, they're playing in the RDS, maybe
yeah.
on the second album, or they're doing some of the outdoor gigs. So you're aware that things are building and growing, but I like there was certainly no sense of, okay, I can identify that these products are coming from Ireland and are huge, and I knew that the first time I saw them. That didn't happen for me.
One final thing I'd like to ask actually is, oh, actually, wait, I did have one thing I wanted to bring up. Sorry, just before I let you go. Your final chapter actually, it's interesting because most of the chapters been dealing with kind of music management and the music itself, but the final chapter actually deals with graphic design. Yeah, I was wondering, like, again, when it kind of just came to choosing which sex of the music industry you wanted to kind of talk about, was there any that you wanted to talk about that didn't come to fruition. And also, one thing, if I could have one criticism of the book, I think it would have been good if that chapter had been aided by photos. I don't know if that was something that was in for consideration, because like a lot of them I just had to Google on my own. Some of them I was familiar with. Obviously, I know like the Joshua Tree album art and a lot of the U2 stuff, but there was some kind of more, I guess, obscure acts.
It's a really good point. I take that criticism. I think you're right. It would be a better book with illustrations. I
Then all the
we
copyright you
might
have to go
even
through.
well, I think with albums and with singles, I think it's fair use.
Yeah.
So you're able to use them. Like, and I think it was just an omission. Like, I think it was just I think the publisher even might have said, yeah, if you've any images, we're open to that. I think we just didn't. And I have to take it on my shoulders. Just didn't get it together. But it's absolutely a fair. It's a fine comment. And in terms of the other question about what do you pick to go into a book, it felt like a longer book when we were writing it, but then when you see it, it's not the longest book ever put out about music, and a history of the Irish music industry would be much longer. But this book was deliberately done to shine a spotlight on things that might be forgotten if someone, and I hope they will, writes a full comprehensive history of the Irish music industry.
Yeah.
And it would, the early genesis was the PhD which was a social history of the Irish music industry from the 1880s to 1985. And I thought, actually, you could just tell the story very quickly, and would be the major labels, the major music corporations came into Ireland. They promised to deliver success to Irish acts, but in the long term, they stopped signing Irish acts and spending money on anything except marketing global acts into the Irish market. So it's one of the saddest economic stories that you could possibly tell.
Mm.
And I thought, that would be a true story, but you could tell it quite quickly. Although you could bring in the grain and the personalities, and it would be a decent book. But this really was kind of a way to leave, because it's the first full-length book on the Irish music industry from kind of like from any perspective. I wanted to leave a couple of things just out of sight, that the next time this story is told, the story of the Irish music industry, that there are a couple of things that could make people stop to think and would kind of reduce the chance of it just being, there was Dana and she was great. And then you had Gilbert O'Sullivan and he was huge and great. And then you had Tin Lizzy and Horselips and Rory Gallagher, that it wouldn't, that we couldn't do the type of history that sometimes gets written about music industries or any industries, where it's just about the products. It's just about the outputs.
Yeah.
And the Steve Averill chapter came about because I thought, when I was writing about U2, when I was writing about Radiators, there's this obvious overlap. There's this obvious assistance that U2 received from the Radiators. But then Steve Averill did so many other things that benefited so many other Irish acts. And I thought, if we're looking behind the scenes, it's not just about management and gig promotion. It's all of the things that you can receive on your local music scene that can give you a competitive advantage, and that might actually be world class.
Yeah.
And, with the graphic design, it seemed obvious to go down there, but I've certainly considered doing a chapter on stage design, on video making, pop music video making. But I just thought the book is limited. There's only so many words in the book. And I just thought, there's a good example, again, of saying, look, if you're writing about the Irish music industry, consider the people who may not seem obvious, but have been crucial in determining how our music industry was shaped.
The last question I'll ask you is where we are now. So in a lot of ways, there's means of being cynical about where Irish music is now, and there's means of being optimistic. So, for example, in a lot of ways, you know, Irish promotion for major concerts is kind of in a duopoly between Aiken Promotions and MCD, and then also Live Nation, Festival Republic, and such. Ticketmaster, in a lot of ways, when it comes to these major groups, have the kind of have a lot of say over a lot of the biggest venues in the country. So if you want to host a gig at a lot of these venues, you have to kind of go through their ticketing system. And the alternative way is, vinyl is kind of making a big comeback. Irish artists are doing the kind of DIY thing where everyone's like self-releasing, self-publishing music. Even the ones that are signing to labels kind of have a lot more negotiating power and can just license their music to a label for a while. Streaming services like Spotify have made it more possible to get your music out there. Simultaneously though, Spotify also has kind of for a lot of people, it's such a big music center for a lot of people that they kind of have to be on there for promotional. I was thinking back to when Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, Crosby, Stills and Nash kind of pulled their music from Spotify. Also Steve Albini, but that was more just for me. When a lot of these big artists were pulling, for ethical reasons, were pulling their music from Spotify. I was thinking, well, that's good if you have like the kind of the capital and the reputation to be able to do that. But at the same time, if you're like an up and coming band, you're not on Spotify. That's like such that's like, I don't know, such a huge market that like you're going to miss if you also have the same ethical concerns that these bigger artists have. Um, but there's a lot of, I think, that punk rock DIY kind of thing coming in. There's a lot of independent venues. There's a lot of alternative ticketing methods. We mentioned some of them: Tickets.ie, Eventbrite, Gigantic, a bunch of these like alternative routes. A lot of indie promoters coming out now: Foggy Notions, UMAC, obviously. You have Selective Memories. You have a bunch of good ones that I'm just gonna forget. Selective Artists are good one. I'm trying to think. There's all these like really good promoters that are just putting stuff on at the moment, and I'm just gonna be annoyed because I'm gonna remember them afterwards. Um, but yeah, like a lot of singular artists, not selective artists, like a lot of these great promoters that are doing their own independent thing. And so I wanted to ask you your opinion on that, and simultaneously also ask you, as a punker, there's a huge explosion in post-punk music in Ireland at the moment. I think spearheaded by Fontaine CC, who I actually saw twice before they broke big. I saw them opening for Franz Ferdinand at the Olympia, and I saw them opening for the Horrors at the Tivoli, which since ceased to exist. But that's the other thing as well, is that a lot of people are annoyed about the cultural venues being taken down. I mean, the Tivoli's gone, a lot of venues are going. And then even like big venues like the Olympia have to get the tree sponsorship just to kind of continue existing. At the same time, there's talks now of bringing in new music venues that are kind of open to the 2500 kind of range, I think, because that was a huge gap in the Irish market. And then also one thing I would like, and I don't know if you'd like it, but I'd like to see more all ages venues in the city. I think everything here is licensed to over 18s. I think this is my personal opinion, but I think the model of under 16s but with adults makes sense from a purely capitalistic standpoint, because on one hand you get to limit liability, and simultaneously you also force an extra ticket sale by having an adult have to buy a ticket. So that just makes sense to me, even if you just want to be purely evil and capitalistic about it. I'm putting a lot on your plate there. I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts on all of these things are.
I think they're great. Like, I think anyone who is helping a band, a DJ, a rapper, like, what a great thing to do in your life. I think that we're at an absolute knife edge, cliff edge, pivotal moment in the history of popular music.
Yeah.
And my personal opinion is that it's not going to end well. I think we've walked into a disaster, a complete disaster, and it won't be easy to reverse. And a country like Ireland will be the most damaged because of the open nature of our economy, because of our dependence on, you mentioned before, international record labels signing our acts. We don't have a tradition of successful, long-term, independent Irish record labels. So we're facing disaster. We're facing annihilation. So any little bright spark of the local promoters, of people putting on good music or giving people a chance to see something that's a little bit different, that's early on, that's not completely dependent on TikTok, um, on likes, on social media metrics, on chart reputation, on huge expensive budgets, is very, very positive. So I
Yeah.
think the music industry is about it's I think it's walking itself, not walking itself. I think the global music industry is running into oblivion
Yeah.
by its own um, design, by its own fault. So there will be a post music industry, a post burnout music industry, and I think it'll be that small I for industry. It'll be, you know, enterprise. It'll be people rolling up their sleeves. It'll be people putting on gigs, knowing that there might only be 10 people there. Who
Yeah.
cares? Like a lot of my favorite gigs, were under 100 people in them. Not just talking about punk rock. I'm talking about people like Jeff Buckley, or Nora Jones. Like, imagine
Yeah.
seeing Nora Jones play, to under 50 people,
Yeah.
a bunch of times.
I think it's
So
so cool that Jeff Buckley played Whelan. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, but just seeing live music to me is one of the most important things you can do.
Yeah.
Like for someone like me, I can only speak for myself. Other people get joy from going to football. I like football, but yeah, I've had a great time going to football matches. But I would look at all of the great events in my life, and a large percentage of them would be live gigs,
Yeah.
for loads of different reasons, loads of different genres over a really long period of time, and it still gives me a huge, huge buzz. So I I don't have any optimism. I don't have any illusions about how there's going to be a great wave of Irish bands that will get heard all over the world. I can't see that happening. I
Yeah.
would love to be proven wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but I just, when you analyze an industry over kind of looking for patterns over 120 years, it seems like we're hitting an absolute brick wall. But the green spots and the things that have always saved the music industry, because it doesn't innovate of its own volition or of its own
Hmm.
design. The music industry has been saved over that 120-year period by innovation that's come from outside. Sometimes it's been huge technology companies deciding, hey, music industry, they don't have a clue how to manage their assets. So Apple, MTV, and Spotify. So let's just jump in there and we'll piggyback our own corporate development on stuff that they own, but they actually don't know how to use or how
Yeah.
to protect. And all throughout history, the music industry has been saved from its own catastrophic, bad decision making by often young people thinking that's not cool.
Hmm.
But you know what's cool? What that person's doing on the corner or in the city,
Yeah.
and no one else likes it. No one over 20 likes it. So let's check that out. And we had it with all of the youth movements that you can name. They didn't start in the music industry. They completely buoyed the music industry and took it to a higher level. So I'm I've no optimism about the future of Irish music in terms of it being heard. I've huge optimism about what's going on, because there's so many Irish bands right now that I actually love and that I get joy from, and that I get a thrill when I go in and buy their product.
Yeah.
Like maybe last 2 years, that there might be more of those putting out music than any other period apart from my early days. So I love seeing those things. Is the is the answer. I love seeing people doing things to help other human beings. And if you're helping someone else to express themselves, you have no idea where that's going to go, how far that is going to ripple. And it might be a global sensation, as Ireland has delivered in the past, or it might be just we broke up after that gig that you put on, but I really appreciate that you put on a gig for us when no one else would. Might be the only gig that band played. Yeah. And they might remember you 60 years later. Oh, thanks very much. So I couldn't be a stronger advocate of do it yourself after studying that industry, for the book.
Perfect, Michael. You have to go now. I really appreciate your time. You've been very gracious. The book is Sounds Irish, Acts Global. Yeah, go buy it. It's really good, and keep us in mind for the next press tour of your next book.
for sure. And if you don't like the book, do your own drawings, your own illustrations, download the illustrations, and slip them in at the back. Cut the book in half, put a whole load of photographs in there, and then staple it together. The DIY, make it a DIY book. Brilliant. Thanks very much for the chance to talk about the book.
Appreciate it, Michael. You've been very gracious for your time. Really appreciate it. Take care.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to that episode of Post-Burnout.com interviews. We hope you enjoyed, and stay tuned for more.